Introduce Andy. Welcome everyone. It's great to see some faces. Glad to be together again, or as together as we're allowed to be just at the moment. Pleased to say, I hope you've received the email and had a look at the menu for next year's School of Theology, which I'm really excited about. Some fantastic speakers lined up for then. Next month, John Hosier is speaking, and I've known John forever, and he's excellent. He kind of kept me alive as a young church leader when we were in our 20s, church planting in Sussex. And he's a really senior leader. He's been all over the world as a Bible teacher. And so we're really blessed that he's able to be with us. But that will be the end of this year, based on the New Testament. Next year, we're going to have a look at the Old Testament, a bird's eye view of the Old Testament, and some accompanying themes. So similar format to this year. So, but John in December, which is great. So let me introduce Andy. And Andy's a friend of mine from Manchester, where he leads a congregation. He also leads Manchester's School of Theology up there, which we've modelled ourselves largely on with a few tweaks. So we're really grateful for all the help that he's given to us. Andy and I last year went to Uganda together and just had huge fun teaching together there, sharing a room, me sitting on my glasses, all the fun and the tragedies that happen on an international trip. So I'm really glad that he's been able to join us this morning, and I know that you'll enjoy him speaking to us on the little subject of 2,000 years of church history. So I'll hand over to Andy. Thanks, Andy.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Well, yeah, it's great to be here with you this morning. Great to join with you at Worcester School of Theology. And yeah, kind of as Richard kind of mentioned, this morning is going to be a little bit different probably to your normal School of Theology session, because I'm going to use both our sessions this morning to look at the small topic of church history. So basically between now and 12:10, I'm going to share with you the story of the church from Jesus right up to the present day. Now, that's basically 2,000 years of church history. We're going to cover that in 3 hours. Okay, now you may be thinking, are you crazy? Well, yes, probably a bit crazy. Someone calculated this for me and said it's something like, we're going to cover something like 10 years of church history every minute this morning, okay? And that's kind of almost including breaks as well, okay? So we're going to be going at breakneck speed through church history this morning. Now, the one thing, I'm up for questions, I'm up for comments, I'm up for all that, but the one thing I forbid anyone from saying to me this morning is, why didn't you cover this? Or why didn't you mention that? Because the reason is because we're covering 2,000 years of church history in 3 hours. I'm just not going to have time to cover everything. This is an overview, so we're going to try and cover as much stuff as possible, but we won't get to everything. Now, Josephine's kind of sent me how you kind of run things this morning. So basically, we're going to have a discussion time, a breakout room at 9:40, which I think is probably going to be, in terms of church history, we're probably going to be at about the year 300 by 9:40 this morning. And then we're going to have our coffee break at 10:30, which I think we're probably going to be at about the year 1000 AD by 10:30. And we're going to have our second discussion group at 11:20. And we're probably going to be in like the mid 1600s by then. And then hopefully we'll get to the present day at 12:10. And you can all go and have a sleep because you'll be so exhausted from all the information I have poured on you this morning, okay? So I'm just going to pray as we start, and then we'll get stuck in this morning. Lord, I pray that you bless our morning together. I pray that you help me to speak words that bless and help your people this morning. And I pray that you will help everyone here this morning to listen and to focus on what's been said, so that through this morning we can grow in our maturity as Christians, as followers of you, Lord. And we ask this in your name. Amen. Amen. Now, some of you might be sitting here thinking, why are we studying church history? Why bother? Well, I just want to start with a few reasons why I think we should study church history. Firstly, because studying church history reminds us that it's not all about us. Now, when you study church history, you begin to realize that millions and millions of Christians have lived and died for Jesus long before you were even born, which I find helpful, reminds me of just how small a cog in God's plan to redeem the world I really am. And you know, that's a good thing to know how small we are. And another reason for studying church history is because it shows us what sacrifice looks like. You know, the reality is, for many of us living in Manchester and Worcester today, we don't have to sacrifice a whole lot to be a Christian today. But we're going to learn about people today who had to sacrifice a lot to live for Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I always find those kind of stories really, really inspiring. And studying church history also helps us not repeat mistakes from the past. Okay, so I want to imagine that at the next School of Theology, Richard turns on his mic and he says, you know what, everyone, I've got a great idea. I think we're going to get all the churches together in Worcester, and we're going to do a fundraiser, and we're going to use the money to pay for an army. And then we're going to go to Jerusalem and start a big battle in Jerusalem. Let's do that. That'll be a great idea, wouldn't it? And you know what? Why don't we call it, I've got an idea for a name. Why don't we call it a crusade? Wouldn't that be a great idea? Now, church history, studying church history means you can say to Richard, if he did ever say that, it's very unlikely, but if he did say that, you could say, Richard, you know, I've studied church history, and church history tells us that someone did try what you're suggesting many years ago, and it didn't go so well. He even called it a crusade as well. So I think that's maybe not such a good idea. So church history helps us not repeat mistakes from the past. And church history also shows us, and I love this, it shows us that God uses ordinary, flawed, broken people to bring about his plan. You know, like, none of the big names in church history were perfect. Like Martin Luther, everyone's heard of Martin Luther, the Reformation. Like, Martin Luther was pretty rude. Like, he was a pretty rude guy. John Wesley, you know, we always think, oh, started Methodism, great guy. John Wesley wasn't a very great husband, you know, didn't treat his wife very well. He was not a perfect guy. None of these people were perfect in this story. But what I love is that God still uses broken, flawed people to bring about his plan. And I think that's encouraging for us all. Studying church history also reminds us of the importance of the gospel. You know, many times throughout church history, the church lost sight of the gospel and focused on other things. And as a result, it lost its way. And then someone kind of called it back to focus on the gospel, and the church was renewed. And I think that's a great reminder for us all in our individual lives to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and the gospel. But the thing I think I love most about studying church history is that it shows us that no matter how crazy things get in the world, and we've had a pretty crazy year in 2020, no matter how crazy things get in the world, God is still in control. He has a plan for his church, and he is working it out, even when it's really hard for us to see. So this morning, we're gonna learn about lots of interesting people. Some of these people did good things, and some not so good. And maybe one day, when you'll get to heaven, you'll meet some of the people you're going to learn about today, and you'll be able to say, hey, I learned about you at School of Theology, and you know what? I just want to say, well done for what you did. Yeah, I want to pat you on the back right now. Now, also, depending on who the person is, you might say, hey, I learned about you in School of Theology, and I'll be honest, I did not expect to meet you here. I really did not. You might find some people like that. But basically, what my hope is this morning is that we will be inspired by church history, which ultimately is our story because we are part of the church. Now, I think Jocelyn has sent around the handouts for this morning. I'm basically going to go through those handouts this morning. If you have them in paper format, that's probably the best way this morning, so you can actually write notes on. But if you have them on your screen, great, have them in front of you while I'm going through stuff. Better to be looking at the notes than me, really. There's nothing to be seen here. You just listen and go through the notes. So let's get started, right? Are we all ready to get started? Thumbs up if you are. Yes, I love audience participation. Okay, that may be annoying for you, but I love a thumbs up and a wave. So let's get started. Now, one of the first things you probably think of when you hear the word history is dates. Now, perhaps that's one of the things you hated about studying history at school was all the dates. Now, I'll be honest with you, there are going to be a lot of dates to remember this morning, but I'm going to start with an easy one. Now, where's Richard? Richard, who's got their mic on? Richard, turn your mic on. I've got a question for you, Richard. Richard, it's a very easy question and it's not a trick question, okay? What date is it today?
November the 14th, 2020.
Yeah.
2020.
2020. Okay, Richard, another question. Again, not a trick question. 2020 years from what?
Roughly from Jesus.
Yeah, roughly from Jesus' birth. Thank you so much, Richard. They're probably not the most difficult questions you've ever answered in your life.
I'm relieved.
Yeah. Now, the dating system that we use and that is used across the world today is centered on the birth of Jesus. Now, the world hasn't always used this dating system. It was invented by a Russian monk called Dionysius in the early 500s. And basically, he worked out when Christ was born, and he called that year 1 or 1 AD. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is the Latin for in the year of our Lord, which basically means the year the Lord was born. Okay, 1 AD. So everything that happened after Jesus' birth, Dionysius dated according to how long it happened after Jesus' birth and put AD after it. So if something happened 100 years after Jesus' birth, he would define that happened in 100 AD. Something happened 500 years after Jesus' birth, he would say that's 500 AD. And likewise, everything that happened before Jesus' birth, Dionysius dated according to how long it happened before Jesus' birth and had the letters BC put after it. BC just stands for before Christ. So if something happened 100 years before Jesus' birth, it will be in 100 BC. If something happened 500 years before Jesus' birth, he would say it happened in 500 BC. So Dionysius made the birth of Christ the date by which all other dates in the world would be measured against. Now, it took a while, but eventually everyone adopted Dionysius's dating system. Now, before then, he used this thing called the indiction dating system. Very complicated. If you've got like a wet Sunday afternoon and you want to be very bored, then look at what that is. But basically, everyone eventually started using Dionysius's dating system. England adopted Dionysius's dating system by 664. The Pope adopted it by 960, Spain adopted it a bit later by the 1300s, and Greece adopted it by the 1400s. And by that stage, everyone was using it, certainly in Europe. Okay, pause. Have we all got that? Are we all thumbs up if we've got that? Yeah, we're happy? Great. Now, here's where it gets a bit complicated. Dionysius probably got his date for Christ's birth wrong. Okay, now he wasn't a lot out, but he did get it a bit wrong. Now, historians reckon that Christ was actually born 4 years earlier than Dionysius thought, which means you have this odd thing where historians have to say Jesus was born in 4 BC. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus was born was 4 years early for his birth, but it means that he was born 4 years before Dionysius thought he was born. Now, let's not give Dionysius a hard time. He was doing this in the 500s. There was no internet. There was no Google. You know, he did a pretty good job, only 4 years out. So if Jesus was born in 4 BC and he died at the age of 33, we would say that Jesus died in roughly 29 AD. There we go. We all got our maths hats on there. So Jesus died roughly in 29 AD. And that's where we pick up the story today. I'm gonna take you from 29 AD right up to the present day. Now, if you have a look at your handouts, I've divided our morning into 4 sections. These are the bits, I think, in yellow. If you've printed out in black and white, well, I don't know what color it's in, but if you've printed out in color, these are the sections in yellow. The first section we're going to look at this morning is the early church from the year 29 to 590. And in this period, the gospel just goes viral. It just spreads incredibly fast right across Europe, the Roman Empire. But what also happens is there's some heresy comes in and they have to defend the truth against kind of false doctrine and stuff. And then the second section we're going to look at this morning is the Middle Ages between 590 and 1517. And the best way to describe what happens in the Middle Ages is things get a bit messy. They just get very messy. And then you have the Reformation, 1517 to 1648. And in that period, we see the rediscovery of the authority of the Bible. The church just had lost the whole kind of focus on the Bible, and they rediscovered it in this period. And then in the fourth section, 1648 to the present day, it's all about mission and revival. Loads of mission, loads of revival in this period. So those are our four sections. So let's get stuck in to section one, the early church. Now we're going to just focus on the first little bit of this. We're going to look at the years 29 to 70 AD, this kind of 41-year period. And the key thing that happens in this period between 29 and 70 AD is the gospel goes from the Jews to the Gentiles. And basically there's three key cities that you have to understand in this period to understand what's happening. And the first, obviously, is Jerusalem. So let's start by talking about the church in Jerusalem. Now, you can read a lot of this in the book of Acts. If you look at Acts chapter 2, we see that Jesus, 7 weeks after Jesus ascends back to heaven, they have Pentecost festival. And there's 120 believers in a home in Jerusalem. They're praying, the Holy Spirit falls, they preach. People hear the gospel in their own language. And to cut a long story short, I'm sure many of us have read it, 3,000 people get saved. So the church grows massively in one day. And we read in Acts 2 that after that, the church begins to grow quite steadily. People are added to the church every day, people getting saved, and it grows and grows and grows. Now, at this point, Christians were all Jews. Christians were all from a Jewish background, right? It's worth saying that right now. And what began to happen after Pentecost was tensions began to arise in Jerusalem between the non-Christian Jews and the Christian Jews. Okay, so the non-Christian Jews are just Jews who want nothing to do with Jesus or Christianity, and then the Jews who become Christians. Tensions began to arise between these two groups. And this led to Stephen being killed in the year 36 by the non-Christian Jews. And you can read about that in Acts chapter 7. Now, Stephen was the first Christian to be killed for their faith, the first Christian martyr. Now, 5 years after Stephen was killed, James, the disciple, the brother of John, is killed too in Jerusalem. And things start getting pretty dangerous for Christians in Jerusalem at this time. And as a result, many of them leave Jerusalem at this time. Among them is John and Peter. They both leave at this time. Peter goes to Antioch, which is a large city 300 miles north of Jerusalem, then on to Corinth, and eventually onto other cities in Turkey. And eventually Peter ends up in Rome. Now, after Peter flees, James, the brother of Jesus, the writer of the book of James, becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But in 62 AD, so in the year 62, he too was killed for his faith, okay? There was a lot of killing going on in Jerusalem at this time. 62, he's killed for his faith. And for a while, the church in Jerusalem was left leaderless. Now, everything in Jerusalem changed, though, in the year 64. Because what happened in the year 64 was the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was completed. It was finished. They'd spent many years building this thing, and finally they'd finished it. You'd think, hallelujah, great, fantastic. Sounds great in reality, but what it actually did was it put thousands of laborers out of work overnight. Now, if any of you know anything about history or politics, you will know that mass unemployment often leads to civil unrest. And that is exactly what happened. 2 years later, the Jews revolted against the Romans. Now, the Roman army was the most powerful, well-developed army in the world at that time. So the Jews did a pretty good job of rebelling against the Romans. They actually held out against the Romans for 4 years. But in the year 70, the Romans finally put down the uprising and completely destroyed Jerusalem, temple and all, while they were doing it. They completely razed Jerusalem to the ground, temple, everything. Not only that, but they burned every synagogue in Israel to the ground as a warning against anyone who would rebel against them. Now, as a result of the persecution, of the destruction of Jerusalem, Christians scattered everywhere. They fled, they went everywhere. And what they did was they took the gospel message with them. Many of them settled in a city 300 miles north of Jerusalem, a city called Antioch. Now I'm going to share a map with you, screen share a map with you, and you'll be able to see that on here. Now I'm going to put that up there. Now, great. So hopefully you should be able to see You should be able to see down in the bottom right-hand corner, you should be able to see where Jerusalem is. Now, if you move the screens, I know a lot of you have your screens down the right-hand side. If you move them to the bottom, you'll see that 300 miles north, just to the right of Tarsus, is a little dot, and that's Antioch. That's where Antioch is. Antioch was 300 miles north of Jerusalem. Okay, now, Antioch, let's talk about Antioch. Antioch was a much bigger city than Jerusalem. There were 500,000 people who lived in Antioch at that time. So it was the third biggest city in the Roman Empire after Rome, which is up in the top left-hand corner of our map, and Alexandria, which you can see right sort of down the bottom in Egypt. It was the third biggest city. Now, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Antioch became the center of Christianity, the hub city, the main missionary sending city. Antioch is also where Christian followers, Jesus followers, were first given the name Christians. At first, they were given this name as a derogatory name. People were like, oh, those Christians. But after a while, they soon began to adopt it and were kind of happy to be called Christians. And in Antioch, a hugely significant thing happened. The Jewish Christians began sharing the gospel with Gentiles, with non-Jews. This hadn't really happened before. Up to this point, the gospel was only really preached to from Jews to Jews. Another really significant thing that happened in Antioch happened in the year 44. Because in the year 44, a guy arrived in Antioch who would take preaching to the Gentiles to new heights. His name was, you guessed it, his name was Paul. Paul was a man of 3 different cultures. He had a foot in 3 different cultures. Firstly, Paul was Jewish. Not only was he Jewish, but he was educated by the famous Jewish rabbi Gamaliel. So he knew his Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, incredibly, incredibly well. Studied it loads. But not only was he Jewish, but Paul also was incredibly familiar with the Greek world. Paul spoke Greek fluently, and Greek was the world language of the day. It's kind of like English is today. Spoke Greek fluently. He was also completely familiar with Greek thought and literature. So Paul was in the Greek world. He was also Jewish, but not only that, he was a Roman citizen, which gave him freedom of movement in the empire, protection on his travels, and access to higher levels of society. Basically, Paul was the perfect guy to spread the gospel to the Gentile world. Like, God knew what he was doing when he saved Paul. You know, he really did. So what happens is Paul then spends the next 10 years preaching the gospel and planting churches across the Roman Empire. And by the year 50, he actually plants the first church in Europe. Okay, and you can see just kind of the middle of our map in Philippi. That's the place where the first European church is. Paul plants that in the year 50 in Philippi. And in 57, by the year 57, Paul gets arrested, gets sent to Rome, and is eventually executed in Emperor Nero's severe persecution of Christians in Rome in the year 64. Now, I'm just going to talk briefly about Rome, and then we'll move on. So Rome, obviously, a map, top left-hand corner, you can see where it is. Now, basically what happened is in the year 64, a fire burned most of Rome to the ground. Now, Emperor Nero needed a scapegoat, needed someone to blame. So he blamed the Christians. Okay, there was a significant number of Christians at Rome at that stage. Now, they hadn't started the fire. It wasn't true, but he just needed someone to blame. And as a result, this began severe persecution of Christians. Many Christians were crucified. Some were like sewn into the skins of wild animals and kind of fed to wild dogs, basically torn to pieces. Some of the women were actually tied to mad bulls and dragged to their death. And after dark, many Christians were burned as evening lamps in Nero's garden. Like they just put them in a cage, doused them with petrol, and burned them. And that's what he used to light his garden parties. Now, at this time, 64 AD, we believe Peter was crucified. So he asked not to be crucified in the same way as Jesus, so they crucified him upside down. Now, obviously, Paul, who was a Roman citizen, there's no way they were going to crucify a Roman citizen. So Paul, we believe, was beheaded at this time. And this is the first systematic persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire in 64 AD. First organized top-down persecution of Christians. Okay, so where we are now, we're at 70 AD. Jerusalem is destroyed. Peter and Paul, you know, the main dudes, the leaders of the church at that time, are both dead. But what we've seen is the gospel has spread to all the major cities of the empire. It's gone to Jerusalem, to Antioch, to Philippi, to Rome. And it's not only Jews who are becoming Christians, but Gentiles are now becoming Christians too. And what we see in the next 250 years, from 70 up to 312, is the gospel spreading not only to these cities, but right across the empire. It goes viral despite persecution. And I've got another map just to show you that. Now, all the city names are all in Latin, which makes it a little bit confusing. So, but just look at it. So basically, by the year 70, now this map basically is a map of the Roman Empire at its height in 117 AD. Now, by the year 70, pretty much the gospel had reached the pink bits in this map. Okay, now I know Israel's not pink, but just generally the pink bits. By 250 years later, by the year sort of 300, the gospel had reached everything on this map. All the green bits had been reached for the gospel. Churches planted, people getting saved. It had spread like wildfire across this whole map. But even if you think about it, just the pink bits, reaching the pink bits by the year 70, just 40 years after Jesus had died and got back to heaven, it's pretty good going, isn't it? Pretty good going. Now, we know that if you have a look at this map, we know that during this period, the gospel spread to France. We know that there was a church in Lyon by 150 AD, Lyon in southern France. We know that the gospel spread to Britain, Spain, North Africa, even as far as India by this stage. And we know that by the year 300, no area of the Roman Empire was untouched by the gospel. Okay, this whole area had been affected by the gospel. And this period sees people getting saved and churches being planted at an astonishing rate, absolutely astonishing rate. So the big question is that lots of people think about and ask is, so why did Christianity spread so rapidly in this period, these first 300 years? Well, basically, the reason it spread was because of four reasons why it spread, okay? The first reason why Christianity spread so rapidly was because people just had this burning conviction to share the gospel. Like they just couldn't keep it themselves. They were like, they'd get saved and they'd just tell all their mates. And they're just like, wow, this is the best thing ever. That's the first reason. People have this burning conviction to share the gospel. The second reason Christianity spread so rapidly was because of something called God-fearers. You may have heard that in the Bible, God-fearers. Now, estimates suggest that 7% of the population of the Roman Empire at that time was Jewish. Now, there were many people in that group who were called God-fearers. So they weren't Jewish by birth, but they kind of liked the religion and kind of participated in it and went to synagogue and were kind of involved in it. Now, what Christianity meant that these God-fearers could get what Judaism offered and more than what Judaism offered, and they didn't have to get circumcised. Okay, so Christianity was very attractive to this group of people. You're like, okay, so we get everything Judaism offers, plus more, plus all the Jesus stuff, and we don't have to, go through with the painful bit, So actually, the gospel was most fruitful, had its most fruitful response from this group, the God-fearers who lived in the Roman Empire at this time. The third reason why Christianity spread so rapidly was because of Christian love. Like people who got saved, that they really loved people. Like Christians would, at this time, they would look after the poor and the sick and the dying when other people just didn't care about them. And actually, there are a number of people, there's a really famous quote of lots of non-Christians, and they would say to each other, see how these Christians love each other. They would look on and wonder as like Christians looked after sick and dying people. Like, wow, look how they love one another. And that was really attractive. People saw that and thought, I want in that. I want to be part of that. And that also contributed to the rapid rise of Christianity. And the fourth reason why Christianity spread so rapidly was persecution, actually. You think, really? Persecution. Many people were converted to Christianity after watching Christians being martyred, after seeing their courage and how they stood up for their faith and they wouldn't back down, and they watched that and they thought, that's real, I want some of that. And many people got converted after watching people getting killed for their faith. So that's why Christianity spread so rapidly. Now, how are we all doing, everyone? Are we all surviving? I realize I've just given you tons of information. Are we all good?
Quick question.
Yes, quick question, yes.
I wasn't sure how you're pronouncing that second thing, whether it was God-fields or fairs, or when you're talking about the Jewish population.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so it's God-fearers. So F-E-A-R-E-R-S. That's basically my accent being from Northern Ireland is the problem there, really. There are certain words that, still have the accent on. So yeah, God-fearers. Yeah, F-E-A-R-E-S. Yeah, anybody else, any other questions, things you want to say? Okay, well then we will move on. So we've seen why Christianity spread so rapidly in this time. So the next question, and this is a question a lot of people ask, is why were Christians persecuted in this time? So these first 300 years, Christians were persecuted quite a lot. Why were they persecuted? Well, there's three reasons why Christians were persecuted in this time. The first reason was because of their distinctive lifestyle. Basically, they stuck out like sore thumbs, really. That's the first reason why they're persecuted. You see, the reality is at this time, for a pagan, a non-Christian, every meal they would have would begin with a liquid offering and a prayer to the pagan gods. Obviously, Christians wouldn't do this. Most parties, if you got invited to a party, most parties were in the precincts of a temple dedicated to some god. Obviously, Christians are like, no, I'm not going to go to that. Christians would no longer go to gladiatorial events because they said, no, these are inhumane. Also, making a living became very difficult for Christians because, for example, if you were a mason, all the work would be in building the latest, pagan temple, and you're like, well, I'm not going to do that. If you were a tailor, all the work was in making garments for like the pagan priests. You're like, no, I'm not going to do that. Also, Christians refused to kill unwanted babies, which was common practice then. If you didn't want a baby, you just threw it out. It's what everyone did. Christians are like, no, we're not going to do that. People are like, why would you not do that? Also, Christians treated their slaves well. Again, wasn't common practice. Christians back then promoted chastity in marriage. It was common practice that men would just sleep around. Christians like, no, we don't do that. No. They also valued family life. And all of these things, lots of which you kind of think are common practice today, but all of these things weren't common practice then. And all of these things made Christians social outcasts. And that's why they were persecuted. That's the first reason, their distinctive lifestyle. The second reason Christians were persecuted this time was because of rumors. There was loads of rumors going around about Christians. Now, you've read in the Bible that Christians often greeted each other with a holy kiss. Well, people got hold of this, and the rumors spread that Christians, they kiss each other. Well, then that means they must do other things. Oh, that means they must have orgies and lots of like crazy sexual stuff. Oh, that's awful. That's terrible. And this rumor spread around that they had loads of orgies. Then some people heard about the Lord's Supper. Wow, they eat the body and blood. Oh, these guys are cannibals. So the rumor spread that Christians were cannibals. And then people found out, they were like, whoa, Christians, they don't bow down to like a statue or an image or a picture of their God, do they? No, they don't have like anything like that. So the rumor spread that they have imageless worship, which means these Christians are atheists. They don't worship God. So basically, these rumors spread that Christians have orgies, are cannibals, and are atheists. And also because Christians, they didn't pay homage to the gods. Christians didn't pay homage to the local gods. So as a result, everybody else in society blamed Christians for everything that ever went wrong ever. So for example, if you're living in your city and the river floods, everyone would say, well, it's clear why this river has flooded. The river has flooded because the Christians did not pay homage to the river gods. And everyone blamed. So anything that went wrong, the Christians were blamed because they didn't pay homage to whatever god that kind of protected them from that. So that's the second thing, distinctive lifestyle, rumors. And then the third thing that meant Christians were persecuted during this time was their refusal to worship the emperor as God. Their refusal to worship the emperor as God. Now, when the Romans conquered a people group, they generally allowed them to still practice their religion if they offered homage to Caesar. Now, they made an exception for the Jews, though. The Jews didn't have to pay homage to Caesar. They were kind of nice about that to the Jews. Now, as long as the Romans saw the Christians as just another sect of Judaism, they were kind of protected from any pressure from the Romans. But what gradually started to happen is the Jews started to make it clear to the Romans that Christianity was actually not a part of Judaism. And when the Romans realized that, that's when the situation changed pretty dramatically. You see, the thing about Jews, the thing about Judaism is it's a closed group. It's a people set apart. The Jews, they didn't go around trying to convert people. But Christians, on the other hand, were always talking about Jesus, always trying to convert others. Not only did they refuse to worship the emperor as God, but they were trying to convince everyone else to do the same thing. So you can see you can see something of why the Christians were persecuted at this time. Distinctive lifestyle, number one, rumors, number two, and their refusal to worship the emperor as God. Now, it may surprise you, but severe persecution against Christians from the Roman Empire, where lots of people were killed, wasn't actually that common during this period. There were only probably about four times in the first 300 years when emperors decided to really persecute Christians. But even then, it was only for a year or two. For long periods of this first 300 years, Christians were generally left in peace by the Roman emperors. Yeah, they had some discrimination. They had hard times. They were discriminated by the general population, but systematic killing wasn't as common as you might think. Still, it was certainly not easy being a Christian at this time. But despite this, Christianity continued to grow rapidly across the Roman Empire. Now, for those of you who have your handouts, there is a little graph in the handouts. It's by a guy called Rodney Stark, social scientist. He's written some fantastic books on Christianity, the rise of Christianity, the triumph of Christianity. But in his book, The Rise of Christianity, he has a little track and he tries to estimate the growth of Christianity. Now, it's interesting. Read the book, you'll see how he comes up with all these stats. Very interesting. But he estimates in around the year 40, there's about 1,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. You get to the year 100, it's grown to 7,000. The year 200, there's 200,000 Christians. Now, he's estimated the population of the Roman Empire at this time was about 60 million people. Okay, so in the year 40, the percentage of the population that is Christian is minuscule, 0.0017. By the year 150, it's 0.07. By 250, the population of the Roman Empire that's Christians is now 1.9%, 1.1 million. And by the year 350, the population of the Roman Empire that is Christian is 33 million, which is 56% of the entire Roman Empire. Like, that's incredible, isn't it? I mean, crazy. Imagine if 56% of England were proper full-on going for it Christians. You think, wow, like, how would that transform our country? I mean, that's what was happening here in the Roman Empire. Crazy, crazy statistics. Now, I'm going to stop this screen share just now. We're going to move on. But yeah, so, right, where are we up to? Let's see, what time are we on? 9:40. Right, okay, let me see. Shall we have a breakout room? Okay, we could do a breakout room right now, or I could briefly tell you about the Bible. Right, Jocelyn said the breakout rooms are ish, so I'm going to go on the ish. Is that, well, I'll tell you about the Bible real quick, and then we'll hit our breakout rooms. Okay, right, okay. So around this time, it was decided what was in the Bible, which is often called the canon. Now, in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Jesus, many writings were circulating among the Christians. Now, some early churches were using books and letters in their services that were definitely a bit dodgy. Heretical movements were rising, teaching pretty crazy stuff and choosing their own writings as authoritative. And people soon realized the need to have a definitive list of the God-inspired books. And gradually it became clear which books were truly genuine, inspired by God, and which were a bit dodgy, to be honest. Now, the three kind of things they used, the yardsticks they used to decide what was going in the Bible is a book self-evidencing quality. So is this book just different from the rest? There's something about it. There's something of God in it. The second yardstick they used to decide if something went in the Bible was it already being used in Christian worship? Our churches around the world already using this as authoritative and God-inspired. And the third yardstick they used was, does it have ties to an apostle? Was this book written by an apostle or someone with direct contact to an apostle? And it was pretty early on, it was agreed what was going to go in the New Testament, what was going to go in the Bible. And certainly by 190 AD, most of the New Testament books were generally completely agreed upon. It wasn't until much later that we have our first definitive list that we have a record of now. It was 367, we have the first complete list, which was written in an Easter letter, written by the Bishop of Alexandria. And then the councils of Hippo in North Africa in 393 and Carthage in 397 published the same list. And what was included in the New Testament wasn't, what was included in the New Testament wasn't decided in a thunderbolt. It wasn't just like, boom, done. But it was decided after many years of thoughtful and prayerful reflection. Now, despite all this good stuff, what was in the Bible being decided and the incredible growth of Christianity, signs were beginning to show that things weren't all hunky-dory in the church, though. Paul had appointed elders and deacons. You can read that in the Bible. But by the year 100, churches became led not by a team of elders, but by one guy. He was called a bishop. Before long, this bishop assumed leadership, not just of individual churches, but of all the churches in a city, and appointed under bishops or priests to lead individual congregations. And over time, this individual leadership began to be abused. And also by about the year 200, most Christians had come to believe that baptism cancelled out all the sins you'd committed up to that point. But sins committed after your baptism, they were a different matter. You needed to do stuff for them to be forgiven, which completely went against the grace of God. People also came to believe that 3 sins in particular, sexual immorality, murder, and the denial of the faith, were so serious that if you did them, you should be immediately kicked out of the church. And everyone believed back then, if you weren't in the church, you were going to hell, because there was no salvation outside the church. Everybody believed that. That was common belief back then. So kicked out of the church was a pretty terrifying thing. There was only one church. You can just go down the road and go to the next one. It was one church. So there was that. Now, then in the year 250, the Roman Emperor Decius began a violent persecution against Christians for 2 years. Now, many Christians were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. Many Christians committed the third of those serious crimes, those serious sins, and denied the faith under serious torture. Now, so many Christians have committed the third of these serious crimes, denied the faith under torture. So the big question is, what do you do with all of these people who have denied the Lord? There's loads of them. Do we allow them back into the church? We've kicked them out, or not? What do we do? So what they did was they set up a system to deal with the different levels of guilt. So a system at different levels of guilt. So like if you were persecuted and you were tortured for a year, and then you recanted your faith, they'd be like, okay, you know what, you did okay. If you were just like, as soon as they captured you, you're like, oh, no, I recant my faith, I'm not a Christian. They were like, okay, you didn't really stand up very much. So they developed a system for different levels of guilt for what you'd done. And they called this system penance. You may have heard the word penance. And basically, depending on what you had done wrong and how severe that was, you would be told to do stuff to show how sorry you were and make up for what you had done wrong. So stuff like wearing sackcloth and ashes, things like that. And only after you had done these things would you be allowed back into the church. Now, this system of penance really went against the grace of God, but it also gave church leaders incredible power over people, because people were terrified of going to hell. And over time, the church began to really abuse this system to gain political power and prestige and money. So that was the period, the year 70 to 312 AD, where the gospel exploded in growth despite persecution. Now, the period we're going to look at next, we're going to have a discussion group now, but the period we're going to look at next is from the year 312 to 590. Now, you might be thinking 312 is a bit of an odd date to start the next section. Well, the reason I've chose this date to start the next section is because 312 was the year of one of the most significant events in all of church history. And that's because it's the year a guy called Constantine became the Roman emperor. And we're going to look at that after we have our first breakout room. Now, what I'd love you to do, I'm going to screen share something before we go in our breakout room. What I want you to do in your breakout room is I'm going to give you 9 key events in church history. And all I want you to do is discuss in your group which order you think they are. So I want you to put them in chronological order. The one that started first at the top and the one that started at the end right at the bottom. Now, I'm going to just screen share this for you. I'll just run through them. Now, these aren't in order, so you don't have to copy these down. They've Jocelyn's also put them in the chat as well. Again, not in order. So I'll just do that. So we've got the canon being closed. So that's when the Bible was decided upon. Let me just play that. You have William Carey going to India. So some of these things we've covered already, some not. We have the church splitting into the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Martin Luther starting the Reformation. Billy Graham beginning his Crusades. The Crusades taking place. The Romans destroying Jerusalem. Constantine becoming the Roman emperor. Again, we just talked about that, just giving you a little bit of a clue there. The Apostle Paul starting his missionary journeys, and that's all 9 of them there. So Justin's going to put you into your breakout rooms, discuss, I think we'll do like 5-10 minutes, I think, discuss what order you think they're in. So if you have someone in your group who can just write down in your group what order you think they're in, and then we'll come back afterwards. All right, thanks everyone. We'll do that in a little bit, but we're gonna push on. We're gonna keep going. We'll have coffee soon, and then we'll have another breakout room as well. Again, if you've got questions, feel free to just give me a shout, interrupt, or ask a question, or if you'd rather put it in the chat, we can pick on that up on that later. I'm very happy to do that. But if I got no questions, I'm just gonna push on with the next bit. So we're gonna start. I talked about Constantine.
Sorry, could I just ask a really quick question about those numbers? I did vaguely remember reading that Rodney Stott book.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the numbers at the beginning, quite different from the ones that are recorded in the Bible. I think he covers it in his book, but I can't remember the answer.
Yes,
it will bug me all time. I don't have
that was one of the things like I first picked up on when I read it. I mean, I think, to be honest, what he would say is I'm making an estimate here. Certainly right back in the early days, it could have been a good bit more, a good bit less than that. But he does talk about it a little bit in the book. And it was definitely the thing I was thinking. I was like, well, hold on a minute here. 3,000 people saved on Pentecost. That puts that number a bit higher than it should be there. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right to pick that up. But I think, he does say it's an estimate, and probably they get a little bit more accurate the later on it goes, because you're a little bit further out, he would say. But do read the book. The Rodney Stott book is a fantastic book, Rise of Christianity. One of the things that's fantastic about that book is he does a chapter on what it would be like to live in Antioch in the early, in those times. Unbelievably well described. I mean, you feel like you're living in the city. Fantastic. So yeah, really good book. But yeah, great question. Anybody else want to say anything? Mention anything? Question? Okay, so we're in 312, but actually just going to check back a year, 1 year before Constantine, to 311. So the year before, in 311, the previous Roman Emperor, Galerius, died. Now, his death ended 8 years of the most severe persecution Christians had ever faced. Now, many Christians were tortured and killed at this time. Now, there was a power struggle for who would be the next emperor. And in 312, one of the contenders for the throne, a young guy called Constantine, marched his army over the Alps and faced his rival just outside Rome. Now, before the battle, Constantine had a dream. And in the dream, he saw a cross, crucifix, a cross, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." So he wins the battle, becomes emperor, and because of this dream, he converts to Christianity. Now, some doubt how genuine his conversion was, because he still did what lots of emperors normally did. He conspired and had people killed and stuff like that. He still did that after he allegedly became a Christian. But there definitely was a change in his life. He allowed Christian ministers exemption from taxes. He abolished crucifixion. He said that's too cruel. He abolished gladiatorial events. Again, that's too cruel. He made Sunday a public holiday. He gave generously to new churches being built. And he had his family brought up as Christians and was baptized shortly before his death in 337. Now, one of the significant things Constantine did was he made a new capital for the empire in what we know today as Turkey. Now, he called his new capital Constantinople, and it remained called that for 1,600 years until in 1930, the Turks changed its name to Istanbul. Now, from this point on, there would be tension between the old capital, Rome, and the new capital of the empire, Constantinople. And we'll talk a little bit more about that about that in a little bit. Now, it's hard to stress just how hugely significant Constantine becoming emperor was for Christianity. Okay, the first thing that happened as soon as Constantine became emperor was state persecution of Christians ended overnight. It was over. Now, before Constantine, Christianity had been outlawed and persecuted. Now that Constantine became emperor, it was now favored and pampered. Now, prior to Constantine, the church was full of full-on Christians who were all willing to die for their faith, because they knew becoming a Christian meant I could die for this. After Constantine, the church became infiltrated by politically ambitious people who weren't really interested in Jesus. They just wanted to become a Christian because Constantine was a Christian and he likes Christians. And if you're a Christian, you're more likely to get a better job in the government. The church gradually became diluted and gradually became used for political purposes. Now, it wasn't long before Constantine made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. Okay, and actually by 380, okay, so this is what, 70 years after Constantine became emperor. By 380, one of the emperors who came after Constantine actually made belief in Christianity compulsory. So I want you to just think about that, right? In 311, you could get killed by the authorities for being a Christian. Only 70 years later, you could get killed by the authorities for not being one. I mean, that is a huge change, isn't it? I mean, that is massive. And one of the results of Christianity becoming the state religion was a lot of arguments began over theology. You know, Christians didn't have to spend most of their lives worrying about staying alive, so they could focus on other things. So they disagreed about theology. We've done a lot of that since, haven't we? And the biggest kind of theological dispute of that time was started by a guy called Arius in 318. And he basically said, Jesus isn't fully God. He's a lesser being. And lots of people disagreed with him. There's this whole big thing. And what Constantine needed Christianity united because he was using it to unite his empire. So he called a church council in 325 in a place near Constantinople called Nicaea. And he gathered 300 bishops of the church were gathered. Now, many of these bishops had suffered terribly under persecution, just 14 years previously. Some of these bishops were crippled because of the persecution. One of the bishops who was invited to this couldn't use his hands anymore because he'd been tortured so much he could no longer use his hands. Another one of the bishops had only one eye because in the persecution 14 years previously, they gouged out one of his eyes. But here these bishops are all maimed from terrible persecution. Here they are as the honored guests of the emperor, all expenses paid, protected by his guards. I mean, it must have been surreal for these bishops. It must have been absolutely surreal. Now, the council decided that Arius was wrong. Jesus was God, not less than him. And a crucial part of the Trinity, which summed up what they believed as Christians, was really kind of cemented and solidified. And as part of the council, they came up with a creed or a statement of belief, which kind of summed up what they believed as Christians. And you can read it in your notes. It's called the Nicene Creed. And this was something that they were all like, right, okay, we're going to agree on this. This is what we all believe. Yes, good, done. Now, Constantine was really happy because he got all his church leaders in a room. He'd said, sort this out. They did. They came up with a creed, statement of belief. Everybody's happy. So Constantine held a banquet to celebrate. And at it, in this really symbolic move, he went over to the bishop who'd only one eye and kissed him on the cheek. This was the bishop who'd lost an eye in the persecution. And he kissed this bishop on the cheek as a sign of the new friendship between the empire and the church. It was a really symbolic moment. And as a result of this union between church and state, theology now came under imperial control. So when there was a theological dispute, the emperor, not the bishops, the emperor was the one who'd call a church council. He'd get all the church leaders, he'd stick them in a room and he'd say, you sort that out. You don't come out till you've sorted that out because I need Christianity united. There were many more church councils in the years to come which condemned heresy and further clarified Christian beliefs and doctrines. Now, after Constantine, moral decay began to set into the church. You know, at one time, people laid down their lives for their faith. Now people in church just fought each other people in church just fought each other for positions of influence, and lots of factionalism and infighting started to grow. Now, around this time, monasticism began to appear. Monasticism began to appear. People who no longer liked what they saw in the state church started to retreat to the desert for prayer and for silence and for solitude. Now, the first monk ever was a guy called Antony. He's been given the term Antony the Great. And in 250, at the age of 20 years of age, he gave away all his wealth and moved into the Egyptian desert and lived in seclusion as a monk, the world's first monk. The first monastery wasn't started till about the year 320, about 70 years later. And this was a group of monks meeting together for silence and solitude. Now, monasticism started out as this radical movement of people who just wanted to live for Jesus with everything they had. And over time, monks became really well respected as spiritual leaders compared to lots of the power-hungry people who seem to be now running the church. And over time, as people realized the state of the church, monks were increasingly appointed to leadership positions in the church because people recognized that these guys were the real deal. You know, they didn't really care about money and power. They just wanted to live for Jesus. These were the guys we want running the church. So they kind of really grew in popularity in terms of people wanting them to run the church. And one such guy, one monk who made a huge impact on the church was a guy called Augustine. Hands up, who's heard of Augustine? Yes, we've all heard of Augustine, yes. Augustine was born in 354 in Algeria, northern Africa. In his early days, he did a lot of partying, he did a lot of sleeping around. But then he recounts this moment that happened in his life. He was walking through a garden one time, and he heard the voice of a child say, "Take and read, take and read." So what he did was he picked up the New Testament and he opened it, and it opened at Romans chapter 13, verse 13 to 14, which says this: "Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh." And Augustine said, after I read that, he said, it was as if the light of peace was poured into my heart and all the shades of doubt faded away. He was a changed man after he read that. By 391, he became the leader of the church in Hippo, which is the main city in his area. And one of the things I love about Augustine, right, is when he was dying, he couldn't move from his bed, like he was bedridden. So what he did was he had the Psalms, taken from the Bible and stuck to the wall of his bedroom and on the ceiling, so that like while he was lying in bed, he could just read the Psalms all day, every day. I think, oh, it's so cool, isn't it? It's such a nice little kind of thing. But Augustine is one of the most significant Christian writers and theologians in all of church history. His writings have helped shape theology ever since, and they're still widely read today. And one of my favorite quotes from Augustine is maybe a quote you've probably heard yourself. It's one of those quotes that people love to put in a picture frame and, hang in their bathroom or the toilet or something. Anyway, and the quote is this. Augustine says this about God. He says, "God, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." You've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Okay, so that's Augustine. Now, probably one of the most famous monks was a guy called Benedict. Hands up, who's heard of Benedict? Yes, we've heard of Benedict, Benedictine monks. Benedict set up the Monte Cassino monastery in 529, the most famous monastery in Europe. It's in Italy. And he set up what's known as the Benedictine monks. And he wrote what's called the Rule of St. Benedict, which is kind of a set of regulations about how to live as a monk. And the beauty of his rule was, unlike lots of other monks, was that his was kind of balanced. A lot of the monks who wrote these kind of regulations, they were really, really severe, really severe, whereas his was kind of balanced, which was good. And Benedictine rule, his kind of regulations, spread all over Western Europe. They were incredibly significant in the Middle Ages. And basically, they gave the only opportunity for study, protection, rest, and it was a great missionary force. And basically, Benedict set up monasticism as we know it today. So if you think of monks, you think of it, it's him who set all that up. Now, this period also saw the emergence of the Pope. Now, the church in Rome had been an important church from very early on, due to firstly it being the capital city of the empire, also the fact that it was the largest and wealthiest church, and also because it had a reputation for good theology and charity. And also it was a big church. By the year 250, the church in Rome was 30,000 people. And Peter and Paul were regarded generally as the founders of the Church of Rome. So they had that kind of as a badge to wear as well. Like, hey, Peter and Paul, they founded our church. And because of these reasons, the church in Rome became very influential. Its bishop was respected by all the other bishops. But up to Constantine, up to 312, there's no evidence that the Bishop of Rome had any official control of churches outside of Rome, just influence and just respect. Now, what happened is when Constantine became emperor, he made a new capital for the empire. It's called Constantinople. And he appointed a bishop of Constantinople. And this bishop received, obviously, his power from the emperor. Now, the Bishop of Rome was a bit disenfranchised. So what they gradually began to do is they began to appeal to Peter and Paul for their authority. They couldn't appeal to Constantine. So they began to appeal to Peter and Paul for their authority, saying, hey, Peter and Paul, set up our church. We're the main church. We're the central one. Now, in 440, Rome got a new bishop. Now, his name was Leo. And in his first sermon, Leo proclaimed himself not just the head of the church in Rome, but the head of all Christendom. Now, this was the first time the Bishop of Rome had claimed authority over all other churches. 5 years later, the Roman emperor made it law that the Bishop of Rome had authority over all Christendom. Before long, the Bishop of Rome began referring to himself by a different name, the Pope, which basically means Papa. Pope means Papa. Now, you may have heard of Attila the Hun, kind of famous warrior. He led lots of armies and killed lots of people. Well, in 452, so 12 years after Leo became Pope or Bishop of Rome, Attila the Hun reached the outskirts of Rome. He was going to destroy the place. The Bishop of Rome, Leo, went out and met Attila the Hun and negotiated with him and managed to get Attila the Hun to withdraw. Now, the people in Rome were like, wow, this is awesome. So they hailed Leo, not the emperor, as the savior of Rome. Now, by this stage, the Roman Empire was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And 3 years later, Rome was plundered by another foreign invader. And Leo, not the emperor, was the one who represented the people and helped them through it. So because of this, the people in Rome began to see Leo, or the Pope, as their leader rather than the increasingly weak emperor. Now, as we approach the end of the early church era, the Roman Empire is crumbling. And by 476, after a series of invasions by Germanic tribes, the Roman Empire finally collapses. Now, with no Roman Empire to bring order anymore, a power vacuum emerges. And the result is lots and lots and lots of wars, battles, destruction, and bloodshed. Europe pretty much descends into utter chaos. And the church becomes pretty much the only institution that isn't destroyed at this time. So increasingly, people start to look to the church for hope and security as everything around them is disintegrating. And then in 590, the year 590, a guy called Gregory becomes Pope. Now, he's the first monk to become the Pope. Now, Gregory was a strong leader in uncertain times. And because of this, people started to look to him, not just for spiritual leadership, but political leadership too. And therefore, after Gregory, the Pope was no longer viewed only as a church leader, but now as an important political leader too. And that view increased as the years went on and on. Now, during this chaotic time, monasteries grew to be the centers of Christian life and learning and mission. And they kept copies of the early Bible manuscripts, they taught theology, they evangelized. Monasteries became the light in this dark period. And over the next few hundred years, monasteries sent out thousands of monks to evangelize the many warring tribes across Europe, and they led many people to Christ. In fact, the first barbarian chief to convert to Christianity was a guy called Clovis in the late 400s. He was the king of the Franks. And it's really interesting. He got saved and he got baptized, but he basically told 3,000 of his soldiers, right, I've got saved, I've given my life to Jesus, you're all doing it too. So they all were like, yes, sir. So they all, because their boss had told them to, all give their lives to Jesus and all got baptized with him. So Clovis and 3,000 of his soldiers all got baptized in what must have been a pretty big lake at one time. But that's what they did. Anyway, now one of the most successful monastic missionary movements at this time was led by a guy called Patrick. We call him Saint Patrick. In around the mid 400s, 432. And he was based in Ireland. And Ireland actually at this time became the base for evangelism of Britain and the European continent. Patrick and his missionary band, they established monasteries all across Ireland, in the UK, and actually all across Europe, actually. Monasteries in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and northern Italy were all founded by Patrick and his Irish missionary movement. He played an important role in evangelizing post-Roman Empire Europe. So next time on St. Patrick's Day, if you're having a pint of Guinness, I don't know if you do that, but remember St. Patrick, like this was a proper full-on missionary. He saw loads of people get saved. Good guy. And it's interesting, right? My wife, actually, Elizabeth, my wife Elizabeth's from Germany. She's from Munich in southern Germany. And her dad said to me a couple of years ago, he's like, Irish monks founded our city. I was like, what? Like, yeah, Irish monks came here, evangelized, led people to the Lord, set up a monastery, and founded Munich. Now, I have not fact-checked that, but there were lots of monks in that region from Ireland who brought the gospel there. So that concludes the early church period from 29 to 590. Don't worry, the other three sections are much shorter, okay? That's not, the other three sections are shorter. Now, how are we doing, everyone? Are we surviving? Are we good? Yeah, thumbs up. One of the reasons I like people with cameras on is that, if people are less likely to fall asleep because they know you're watching them, it's that kind of thing. You turn your camera off, you can do whatever, you might not even be there. So I'm like, okay, people are still awake. That's good. I'm happy, right? So next we're going to look at the period. Now we will have a coffee break soon. Yeah, where are we up to? Yeah, we'll have it soon. Next we're going to look at the period from 590, year 590 to 1517, which is often called the Middle Ages. And honestly, you know what? Things during this period just get very, very messed up. Okay, very messed up. All right. So that's this period. Now I'm going to screen share something for you. It's another map. Those of you who are loving the maps, I'm going to screen share another one of those. Let's see. And there we go. Okay. So I will explain this just in a few moments. So when Constantine made Constantinople his capital, a rivalry began between the old capital, Rome, which you can see in the center of the map there, and the new capital, Constantinople, which is over more towards the right of Rome. Now, this rivalry soon began to divide the church. The church in the east of Europe looked to the Bishop of Constantinople for leadership, and the church in the west of Europe looked to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, for leadership. Tensions grew and grew and grew over the years until in 1054, the church finally split in two. And you can see the divide here kind of geographically on this map. You've got the Roman Catholic Church to the west and the Eastern Orthodox Church to the east. The Catholic Church in the west was ruled by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and the Orthodox Church in the east was ruled by the Bishop of Constantinople. Now, this was the first official church split. Up until that point, there'd only been one church. It was called the Church. They didn't need to have another name for it, the Church. Now there were two. There were the Roman Catholic Church and there was the Orthodox Church. Now, the Orthodox Church soon spread to Greece, to Bulgaria, Ukraine, Russia, Romania, and is still the biggest religion in these countries today. Now, when it comes to what Orthodox Christians believe, they actually believe a lot of the same things that we do, but Orthodox Christianity, it just looks much different in worship and practice. Now, they kind of emphasize certain things different more than us. So like for us, the center of us being Christians is being made right with God. That's the center of us for being Christians. That's the focus. How are we made right with God? It's through Jesus, dying on the cross for our sins, right? For Orthodox Christians, they have a different focus. Their focus in terms of theology is very much on the fact that we as humans are made in the image of God. And what sin does is sin reduces the image of God within us. And salvation for the Orthodox believer is the perfection of the full image of God within us through Jesus. And so for them, the reason Christ came to earth was to restore the icon or the full image of God in us. So that's their kind of emphasis. Now, for Orthodox Christians, icons or pictures of saints and of Jesus are very important. If you walk into an Orthodox believer's house, you'll often see in the corner almost like a little shrine with candles and a picture of Jesus and saints. And these are very important to Orthodox believers. They believe these are almost like a window between heaven and earth, and they often use these to pray and things like that. So I'm just going to stop the screen share now. Yeah, so around this time also, the Pope was becoming more and more powerful. Now, the reason the Pope was becoming more and more powerful around this time was because he had two very powerful weapons at his disposal that no other political leader was able to use. Now, his two weapons, the first one was excommunication. Now, this was something that would be used against individuals. If you did something wrong, he could just excommunicate you, which was kicking you out of the church and basically condemning you to hell, right? Excommunication was for individuals. And the second weapon he had was an interdict, which is basically an excommunication, but for not just for an individual, but for an entire nation. So he could basically say to an entire nation, you are kicked out of the church. You can't go to heaven now. You're going to hell. Two very, very powerful tools he had at his disposal. Now, one pope actually around this time used or threatened to use interdicts 85 times against uncooperative kings in his reign. Okay, incredibly powerful. So a king would come and say, I want to do this. Pope says, if you do that, I'll do an interdict. King's like, okay, I will not do it. Now, another pope at this time actually had a disagreement with Henry IV, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the most powerful political ruler at that time. And Henry got into a bit of a disagreement with the Pope, and they had a bit of a war of words, and Henry IV said, you're unfit to be Pope. You're a rubbish Pope. So the Pope excommunicated him, excommunicated Henry IV, the most powerful political ruler. Now, this wouldn't do. So all Henry IV's political advisors said, you have to get back into the church. You can't be excommunicated. So Henry had to show up to the Pope's residence, and I think it was actually snowing. It was pretty cold. He showed up in the Pope's residence barefoot and begged for forgiveness. And the Pope made him beg for forgiveness barefoot for 3 days. 3 days he begged for forgiveness before the Pope allowed him back into the church. That is some power the Pope had. Okay, you can imagine a church leader, and having those powerful, politician in the world outside your church begging you to get back in. I mean, it's beyond belief, isn't it? Now, by the 1200s, the church and the Pope was now incredibly powerful because of these weapons. Now, the strength of the Pope and the church was strengthened even more at this time by the formalizing of theology of the Catholic Church. And one of the key figures in this was a guy called Thomas Aquinas. Now, Aquinas' main book was called Summa Theologica, and in it, he basically formalized the theology of the Catholic Church. So things such as submission to the Pope for salvation, treasury of merit, penance, purgatory. He helped make standard belief in the Catholic Church. He standardized, he codified them all. And all this strengthened the power of the Church and the Pope. Now, we are going to talk about the Crusades. Who's up for hearing about the Crusades? Yeah, we got some people. Yes, Crusades. This is fun. If you like blood, guts, gore, and all that kind of stuff, there's going to be lots of that in this. Okay, so around this time, Islamic forces were now invading large areas of the Middle East. Now, in 570, Muhammad born in Saudi Arabia, told his wife that he'd been visited by an angel who told him to recite down what he saw. And the result was the Quran. And people began to follow him, and Islam was born back in 570. Now, Islam grew rapidly over the next few centuries through invasion and conquest and bloodshed. And before long, they had taken Israel. They had taken control of Israel. And in the year 1095, in response, the Pope proclaimed a thing called a crusade to go and retake the Holy Lands back from the Muslims. And what the Pope did was he promised if soldiers and knights would go on this crusade, he would give them full forgiveness of all their past sins. Okay, now that just shows how far the Pope had gone from the teaching of Jesus. You know, like in the Bible, really, Jesus forgives us from our sins through the cross. And the Pope is saying, if you go kill some Muslims, I'll give you forgiveness of sins. Like crazy. I mean, the Gospels just completely disappeared. So in 1095, 5,000 knights and infantrymen go to Jerusalem and they capture it. And what the Pope does is he realizes, I need money to fund this. So what he does is he introduces not just forgiveness of sins for going on the crusade, he introduces forgiveness of sins if you just give some money towards it. So he'll say, if you give money towards the crusades, I'll forgive you for your sins. Now, 100 years later, the Muslims retake Jerusalem. And in response, 3 kings, Frederick of Germany, Richard the Lionheart, we've all heard of him, and Philip of France lead another crusade to retake Jerusalem. But it doesn't go very well at all, okay? First thing happens is Frederick, one of the kings, drowns on the way there. Okay, we're down to 2 kings. That's fine. But Richard and Philip, the 2 remaining kings of England and France, argue so much on the way there that Philip decides, oh, stuff this, I'm going home, and just leaves Richard there. And Richard fails to retake Jerusalem, and eventually he goes home as well. So it's a complete failure. 10 years later, the Pope sends another crusade to go and retake Jerusalem. Now, this crusade, I think young people would describe this crusade as an epic fail, okay? It's a failure on every kind of category possible. It's a failure, right? What happened was the Crusaders had to get ships to Jerusalem. Now, they had to go through Venice, and they didn't have enough money to pay the Venetians who were going to transport them. So the Venetians said, well, you don't have to pay us. What you can do instead is, there's this town we don't like called Zara, just down the coast. It's a Christian town, but we really don't like them. If you could just go and like destroy that town and kill all the Christians in it, then we'll take you to Israel. So they did. They went and destroyed this Christian town called Zara. And then the Venetians said, well, it's a long way to Israel. So what we were thinking is, why don't you just go to Constantinople instead and like destroy it instead of going to Jerusalem? So I don't know what the Crusaders were thinking, but yeah, they just went to Constantinople and just ransacked the place and destroyed it and raped and pillaged and did awful things and just completely forgot, oh yeah, we're meant to go to the Holy Land and do stuff in Jerusalem. It was a complete and utter failure. And with that, the era of the Crusades ended in 1291 when Acre, the last stronghold of the Christian nations in the Holy Lands, fell to the Muslims. The Crusades, I mean, I don't know what you've heard about it before, but I don't think there's any doubt the Crusades were a complete and utter failure in every way conceivable. They didn't win the Holy Land back, or stop the advance of Islam, or heal the split between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. The Crusades basically show us the terrible state the church was in back then. The Crusades show us that the church, and particularly the Pope, had forgotten 2 very important things. Firstly, Christianity is not about special geographic places. God lives in each of his followers through the Holy Spirit, not in buildings or in temples. And secondly, the Pope had forgotten that war and bloodshed are never the way to extend God's kingdom. That comes through evangelism, sharing the good news. The church had completely lost sight of this. The Crusades had nothing to do with the gospel. They were primarily about politics and so-called church leaders abusing their power to lure people into war. The Crusades can definitely, absolutely go down as one of the darkest periods in church history. And on that note, that happy, joyful note, why don't we break and have some coffee? Who's up for that? Yeah, I'm definitely up for a cup of tea. So we'll have Josephine, I don't know, over to you. Do you want a 10-minute coffee break or whatever?
Yeah, so we'll have 10 minutes. What I'll do is I'll open breakout rooms because in case people want to sort of get together to chat with each other, so you can go to a breakout room if you want to. You can hang around in this room and in the main room and chat to people if you want to, or probably most of you will just want to go off and stretch your legs and get a coffee, but we'll see you back at 10:40. Okay.
Yeah, we'll make a start. So
sorry.
So sorry there. We ended on not a great note to finish on. There was things have got quite a bit messy, really, with church history in these years, with the Crusades and the Pope abusing power. And I think really these were dark times in church history. But Jesus and the gospel weren't totally forgotten in these times. There were some little glimmers of hope at this time. A guy called Arnold in Brescia, which is northern Italy, showed up in 1155, and he called the church to give up its property, give up its wealth and riches, and return to the way of the apostles. But you'd think, okay, well, that makes sense. But these beliefs were a little bit too radical for the time. So he was executed for his beliefs in 1155. Around the same time, a guy called Peter Waldo appeared in France in the kind of late 1100s. And he gave all his stuff away. And he translated bits of the Bible into French and sent followers out in twos into the countryside to teach people God's word. And these followers of Peter Waldo became known as the Waldenses, which was a movement which spread across southern France. And they made scripture their authority. They kind of lived by scripture. And then in Italy, we have another glimmer of hope with Francis of Assisi. You may know more as St. Francis of Assisi. And he appeared again in the late 1100s. And he also formed a little group of preachers. And like Waldo, they went around Italy sharing God's word with people. So it wasn't all bad, but it was a pretty dark time. Now, the power of the Pope reached its height in the 1200s. But by the 1300s, it was starting to weaken. Now, around this time, Philip I, the King of France in the 1300s, had a power struggle with the Pope. Now, you remember the previous power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor had to come and beg on his knees for the Pope to give him forgiveness. Well, Philip had a power struggle with the Pope. This is a little bit later, and he won his power struggle with the Pope, unlike Henry previously. Basically, Philip wanted to tax the clergy in France. And the Pope said if he did this, he would excommunicate him. And so what Philip did was, Philip sent some guys to Rome and beat the Pope up. Like, that's actually what he did. He just sent some guys to Rome and they gave the Pope a good kicking. And they gave the Pope such a kicking that a few weeks later, the Pope actually died. It's a pretty crazy story, but what it shows that European rulers no longer accepted the Pope's interference in political matters. And this moment came to symbolize the descent of the power of the Pope, just as Henry IV begging the Pope for forgiveness symbolized its ascent 2 centuries earlier. Now, the power of the Pope was further weakened in the late 1300s, when a bit of a mess up occurred, which led to 2 popes being appointed. Now you kind of think, how does that happen? Well, basically, how popes were appointed back then was the College of Cardinals appointed popes. And what happened is that in April 1378, a new pope was appointed by the College of Cardinals. But what happened is later in that year, the College of Cardinals said, you know what, I think we made a mistake here. No, he shouldn't be Pope. And then they appointed another Pope. But the first Pope was like, no, I am the Pope. And the second Pope was like, well, I'm the Pope. So we had 2 popes. Right? Now, to sort this out, they needed to have a church council. Now, the problem was canon law, church law dictated that only the Pope could call a church council. And no one could agree on who the right Pope was. So basically, nobody knew what to do. So for 39 years, there were 2 popes. Now, I don't know how they managed it, but after 39 years, they managed to get a church council. And what they did at this church council was they sacked both popes and appointed a new one. The problem was that the sacked popes didn't accept this decision and said, we're still the pope. So basically what you have is you had a church council that was supposed to make 2 popes into 1 pope, now ends up with 3 popes. So now you have 3 popes, and people are like, oh my goodness, what is going on? Well, eventually they have another church council. They get rid of all 3 popes and appoint a new one, and the sacked popes accept this, and all is kind of, sorted and everything. But all this whole debacle, all further weakened the power of the pope. And to cap this all off, a guy called Rodrigo Borgia, and now you may have seen the TV series, the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia became pope in 1492, and he took corruption, immorality, and greed to new levels never seen before in the papacy. Up to this point, a lot of the guys who became pope, a lot of them weren't very good, but they kind of tried to hide it. This guy just didn't care. He was just completely corrupt, immoral, greedy, everything. He only seemed concerned for getting wealth and status for his family. And this further weakened the power of the Pope. Now, the Middle Ages were a dark time in church history, but I'm going to end it on a positive note by telling you about 2 absolute dudes, okay? Right? You meet these 2 guys in heaven, you give them a pat on the back, you shake their hand, you say, well done, okay? The first of these dudes, John Wycliffe, right? Real great guy. And the second is a guy called Jan Hus, Czech guy called Jan Hus. Now, firstly, John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an Oxford academic in the 1300s. And he challenged many of the traditional beliefs of the Catholic Church because basically he could find no reference for them in the Bible. So he challenged indulgences, adoration of saints, treasury of merits, worship of images, and the idea that men needed priests to mediate between them and God. And what was revolutionary about John Wycliffe was that he read the Bible, okay? Not many people did that back then. And he used the Bible as his yardstick to judge the church rather than the church judging the Bible. And he was eventually silenced. His views were not popular. He was eventually silenced academically at Oxford, and he was forbidden to write or teach there. So what he did was he turned to the peasants in the local villages. He got the Bible translated into English, and he sent the peasants, his followers, out 2 by 2, preaching the word in all the local towns and villages. And this spread, and these people became known as the Lollards. You may have heard of him. Now, John Wycliffe wasn't executed for what he was saying, for his beliefs, but that's not because his beliefs weren't radical. It's basically because he had powerful friends who prevented him from being executed. Now, someone who was greatly influenced by Wycliffe's writings was a guy called Jan Hus. Jan Hus was the rector of one of the main churches in Prague, in what we know today as Czech Republic, and he preached against the abuses of the Catholic Church, just like Wycliffe had. But eventually he was imprisoned, and he was told to recant, take back his beliefs, or he'd be burnt at the stake. And he refused to do this. So on July the 6th, 1415, he was brought to the place of his execution. And on the way, he was led past a bonfire of his books. They were burning all his books. And apparently, as he passed this bonfire, he laughed and told bystanders, "Don't believe the lies they say about me." And off he went, completely calm, laughing. He's just like, wow. He was asked one more time to recant, to take back his beliefs just before they were going to kill him. And he said this: "God is my witness. The evidence against me is false. I have never thought nor preached except with one intention of winning men, if possible, from their sins. In the truth of the gospel, I have written, taught, and preached. Today, I will gladly die." And they burnt him to death. That is Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, 2 absolute dudes. Give those guys a pat on the back and get to heaven. You know, after all the mess of the Middle Ages, we begin to see these glimmers of hope. The Bible and the gospel are starting to be rediscovered. Change is coming. And it's about to speed up dramatically because of a new invention. In 1439, a guy called Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. Now, the printing press is one of the most important inventions in all of history. Okay, it's up there with the computer, with the internet. Hugely important invention. it quite simply, the printing press quite simply changed the world as people knew it. Before the printing press, if you wanted to disseminate some information, you would have to hand copy the copies, which would take ages, and you wouldn't be able to do very many copies. After the printing press was invented, you could mass produce information and send it across countries, continents, everything. It transformed how quickly you could disseminate information. Now, this is really important. Now, not long after the printing press was invented, a guy called Martin Luther came on the scene. Now, remember that name, because Martin Luther is one of the most important figures in all of history, never mind just church history. He's probably the most important person you will learn about today. And he believed very similar things to Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, but unlike them, he managed to transform the entire European church beyond recognition and change the face of Christendom forever through something he started called the Reformation. And one of the main reasons he succeeded where Wycliffe and Huss didn't was because he came after the invention of the printing press, whereas they came before it. So if Wycliffe wrote a document condemning the abuses of the Catholic Church, it would have to be hand copied. They'd maybe get 20 copies done and disseminate them. But it was very easy for the authorities to trace down 20 copies of a document, burn them, and the ideas are gone. But with Luther could write a document about the abuses of the Catholic Church, take it to the printing press, and get 20,000 copies done overnight. And they would be disseminated right across Europe. It was impossible for the authorities to track all those documents down. That was the huge difference between Luther and Wycliffe and Huss. And that's why the printing press was such a significant invention. So that concludes the Middle Ages period of church history from 590 to 1517. Next, we're going to look at the period 1517 to 1648, which is most commonly known as the Reformation. And that's all about the rediscovery of the authority of the Bible. How are we all doing, everyone? Are we all surviving? We're good. Are you ready for the Reformation? Yes. We're going to get a little bit of Henry VIII in here. Henry VIII always wakes everyone up in a history class. I know, because he's always a lot of fun. We're going to have a bit of Henry VIII, a bit of Martin Luther. So we're going to hit the Reformation. Lots of stuff happened here. Right. Okay. Reformation. Now, the Reformation was, as I mentioned, was a movement started by Martin Luther to reform the abuses of the Catholic Church. And that's why it's called the Reformation. Now, Luther was born in Germany in 1483. And when he was 22 years of age, he got caught in a really bad thunderstorm. And he prayed out to St. Anne, save me and I'll become a monk. And he did get through the thunderstorm, so he did. He became a monk. But as a monk, he always felt unworthy before God. He always felt like, I'm failing, I'm sinning too much, I'm this, that, the other. And around that time, he started doing something that very few people did back then. He started reading the Bible. And when he was 32, the age of 32, while reading the Bible, he had an incredible light bulb moment, just where the lights came on. He was like, wow, I see it now. Basically what he did was he read Romans chapter 1, verse 17, which says this: for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. And Luther it just changed his life reading that verse. He said, as I read that verse, I felt myself to have been reborn and have gone through open doors into paradise. This was almost like his conversion moment, really. And basically what happened is when he read that verse, he realized for the first time that justification, being made right with God, was by faith alone. Not faith in good works, not trying to be good and earn it. No, it's by faith alone. It was by faith alone, not by faith in good works, as the church had been teaching for the previous 1,000 years. 2 years later, in 1517, the Pope needed more money to build his new big church in Rome, St. Peter's Basilica. You can visit there today, it's still there. So what the Pope did was he sent a guy called Johann Tetzel around Germany to sell these things called indulgences. Now, indulgences were certificates you could buy which guaranteed that your sins would be forgiven. Now, Luther, who was now a theology professor in the University of Wittenberg, a city in Eastern Germany, was horrified. Like, he was just like, the church has descended to a new low. It has taken the forgiveness of sins, something that's supposed to be a free gift from Jesus, and sold it to people for money. And this is awful. Like, he was horrified. And in response, Luther wrote what's famously become known as his 95 Theses. And he nailed them to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Now, the church door, basically, back then, was the normal notice board for the university. So it was kind of a normal thing to do if you wanted to announce something. And his 95 Theses were basically 95 statements he made condemning the excesses and corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, especially the practice of asking for money for the forgiveness of sins. And Luther believed, as we do, that forgiveness of sins only comes as a free gift through Jesus' death on the cross. Now, his 95 Theses were quickly produced. Yeah, we have the printing press. They were mass produced and disseminated right across Germany and Europe, and they started the Reformation. And he then wrote a series of further pamphlets which highlighted many more abuses within the Catholic Church. And these too were widely published via the printing press. Now, the Catholic Church tried to get him to back down, but he refused to. So in 1521, they declared him a heretic and excommunicated him from the church. And famously, Luther was given this letter of excommunication, and he got all his mates together and his students, and he lit it. And he burnt this letter of excommunication in front of his mates, saying, "That's what I think of your letter of excommunication." That same year, Luther again refused to back down over his writings. He'd been brought before the Holy Roman Emperor at like a church council, and he again refused to back down over his writings. So the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Germany, he was standing before him. Luther's there. Charles says, "Take back these writings." And Luther famously says there in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, "Here I stand. I can do no other." And in response, Charles V declared Luther an outlaw and a heretic, and basically gave permission for anyone to kill Luther without any consequence. He was basically saying, you can walk up to him in the street, stab him to death, and you will not be punished. That's what Charles was saying. And Luther was standing there saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He's like, "Look, if you're going to kill me for this, kill me. This is what I believe. This is what's right." Now, it looked like Luther was going to be executed there and then, but a German prince who liked Luther abducted him and hid him away in one of his castles for a year so that things would calm down a bit. And there he translated the New Testament into German, which was a hugely significant thing, because up to that point, the Bible was only available in Latin. Normal people couldn't read Latin, so only the clergy could read it. So Luther translating the Bible into German meant that common people could now read the Bible for themselves. And I visited the room in this castle that Luther was holed up in like 2 years ago. And I was just like, wow, like it's just like a normal room. And I was like, this is such a significant thing happened in that room. Now, after spending a year translating the New Testament, Luther returned to Wittenberg and set about a series of reforms. He abolished bishops and celibacy. And in so doing, he got married. He took a wife. He decided to give people wine as well as bread at communion, because up to that point, people only got bread. He shifted the emphasis in church services from the mass, from the communion, to the central thing being the preaching of God's word. And these reforms and many others spread right across Europe. And in 1529, Charles V, the same guy who tried to kill him earlier, put pressure on the princes of Germany to crack down on Lutheran teaching. And many of the princes who now followed Luther's teachings protested against this, which is where we first get the term Protestant from. These were the people who were protesting against being told you've got to crack down on Luther's teaching. And soon this term Protestant came to refer to anyone who followed Luther's teachings or other reformers who came after him. Now, Luther's biggest contribution to Christianity was the answers he gave to 4 basic questions. Question 1, how is a person saved? Luther said, not by works, but by faith alone. Question 2, where does religious authority lie? Luther said, not in the visible institution called the church, that's not the ultimate authority, but in the word of God found in the Bible. That's the ultimate authority. Question 3, what is the church? Luther said that the church is the whole community of Christian believers, since all are priests before God. It's not just the priests, it's everyone who's a professing believer of Jesus. And question 4, what is the essence of Christian living? Luther said, serving God in any useful calling, whether ordained or lay. So he got rid of this whole like difference there was between priests and normal people. He said, no, we're all priests, we're all believers, we're all followers of Jesus, we're all in the same boat. Now, Luther is so important. It's really important that we get how big Luther is here. Luther is so important because he pretty much came along and said to the church, I've read the Bible and it says you've been doing it all wrong for the last 1,000 years. Okay, that's what he said to the church pretty much. But what's more, for 1,000 years, European society had been built on the established church. So he wasn't just taking on the church, but the entire European establishment at the time. And that takes some serious guts to be able to do that, to basically stand against the world and say, you're all wrong. The Bible says this, you're all wrong. But that is what Luther did. And that is why Luther, despite not being perfect, goes down as one of the most important people in all of history. Now, we good with Luther? We happy? Yes? I think we're all like, Luther, good guy, okay? We're yeah, he's one of the good ones. Yeah, I think we're all probably agreed on that. Now, around the time of Luther, a group arose who believed Luther didn't go far enough in his reforms. And as they read their Bibles, they realized that people in the Bible were baptized as believers, adults, not as babies, as was common practice then. Now, the whole kind of practice of baptizing babies kind of became common practice more in by about 300 AD, it became common practice. It wasn't as commonly practiced before then. So these people read this, they thought, I don't see this in the Bible. So they stopped baptizing their babies and started baptizing adults upon profession of faith. Now, because of this, they were given the name Anabaptists, which means rebaptizer. You know, they were called Anabaptists because they thought everyone's baptized a baby, but you're rebaptizing yourself, you're going again. But these Anabaptists, they became severely persecuted for doing this. And in Zurich, on the 5th of January, 1527, the first Anabaptist, a guy called Felix Manz, was executed. Now, have a guess of the method they chose to execute a guy for believers' baptism. Yeah, you guessed it. They drown him. Yes. They thought, you know what? You want water? We'll give you water, lots of it. We'll dunk you under there, but we're not picking you up again. Yeah, we'll hold you under until you are dead. And that's what they did. They killed him. They executed him in the river on that day in January. And during the Reformation, a thing that a lot of people don't really know is that during the Reformation, a further 4,000 to 5,000 Anabaptists were executed purely for believing in believers' baptism. I mean, crazy. You think like something that's, you know, so many Christians believe is just standard today. Now, the Anabaptists also believed in discipleship, that being a Christian involves a daily walk with Jesus. They believed in congregational leadership. They believed in separation of church and state. All things that we take for granted today, but these things were revolutionary at the time. And many Anabaptists paid for these beliefs with their lives. They were killed for them. Now, we've done Luther. We're going to probably come to the second, probably most famous reformer, who is John Calvin. Yes, I lip read some people there. John Calvin. Right, we're going to look at John Calvin. Now, John Calvin was a French university scholar who lived in the mid-1500s. And who, around the time of the Anabaptists were being martyred, he got saved and devoted his life to the Protestant cause in France. And after fleeing Paris in 1533, he settled in the Swiss city of Basel. And in March 1536, he published a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, this is the clearest explanation of Protestant doctrine that the Reformation age produced. And it made the 27-year-old Calvin, he was only 27 when he wrote it, it made 27-year-old Calvin instantly famous across Europe overnight. Not long after, he had to flee again and ended up in the Swiss city of Geneva. And there he was made the professor of sacred scriptures. And he set about making Geneva into a Protestant city. And he wrote a confession of faith that everyone had to sign who wanted to be a citizen of Geneva. And he set up a rigorous program of moral discipline for everyone in the city. And Calvin established what we call the Reformed tradition of Christianity. Now, he and Luther pretty much agreed on most things, but they just emphasized different things. So Luther always emphasized justification by faith. Calvin always emphasized the sovereignty of God, the fact that God is in control and has a purpose. Calvin focused on the doctrine of predestination, the kind of idea from Ephesians that God chooses to save people. And he considered this a deep source of confidence and humility. And Calvin was also very much into bringing the kingdom of God to earth. He believed that Christians should aspire to holiness and live upright lives, and aspiring to perfection is not just something in the future, but it's something we should try and do now. Now, many people came from across Europe to see Calvin's Geneva, and they exported his ideas back to their homelands. And his ideas spread to France. And French Calvinists became known by a particular name. They became known as Huguenots. French Calvinists became known as Huguenots. And these French Calvinists, these Huguenots, they included many of the elites of French society. And they basically, these guys, they were moving France towards becoming a Protestant country. And if they'd have kept going, it would have become a Protestant country, completely Protestant country. But for something that happened on a day in 1572. On one day in 1572, thousands of Huguenots, these French Calvinists, were brutally killed by a Catholic mob. And this day became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. But for this day, France would probably now be a Protestant country. But as it is, it's a Catholic country. Now, Calvinism also took root in the Netherlands and in Scotland in Scotland it took root under a firebrand preacher called John Knox. You may have heard of him. And by the 1560s, Scotland had become the most Calvinist country in the world under Knox's leadership. And the effect of Calvinism can be seen in the fact that the Netherlands and Scotland are still Protestant countries, even to this day. Now, we're going to get to Henry VIII. Some fun bits. Actually, maybe not so fun, because you've probably all done it in history class anyway, but I'll bat through Henry VIII pretty quick. But around this time, the Reformation arrived in England in quite an unusual way, which probably a lot of you know. In 1525, the king, Henry VIII, wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry a younger woman called Anne Boleyn. Now, the only person who could grant a divorce back then was the Pope. So Henry asked the Pope to declare his marriage to Catherine invalid. The Pope said, no. The Pope said no. Henry was pretty peeved, to say the least, and so instead, he just got an English court to declare his marriage to Catherine null and void. And in 1533, he married Anne Boleyn. So he just kind of ignored the Pope, pretty much. The Pope responded by excommunicating Henry. Henry didn't really seem too bothered, though, and just passed a law making him the head of the Church in England instead of the Pope. So apart from replacing the Pope with himself as the head of the Church of England, Henry didn't really change any of the Church's beliefs or theology. He kept the Church pretty much the same. So in that sense, the Reformation's principles hadn't really arrived in England yet. The only two things he did change was he closed down lots of English monasteries and took their land and money for himself, so made himself a bit of money through it. And he also published an English Bible for use in churches. Now, that had never been done before. Having an English Bible that sat in the church, that had never been done before. Up to that point, that was completely forbidden. Having a Bible in the language of the people just was not allowed at that point. Now, the way that Henry came to publish an English Bible has an interesting story. The pioneer of the translation of the Bible into English was a guy called William Tyndale. Anyone heard of William Tyndale? Hands up. Yes, we've got a few people. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English, and in the 1520s, he smuggled copies into England from the continent. It was too dangerous to do this in England. Now, this wasn't allowed by the authorities. This was not allowed to publish the Bible in the language of the people. And eventually, Tyndale was caught and imprisoned for this, and he was actually executed for translating the Bible into English so people could read it, all right? And his dying prayer, this is what he prayed just before they killed him. His prayer was this: Lord, open the King of England's eyes. Lord, open Henry VIII's eyes. Open his eyes. And it wasn't long until his prayer was answered. Only a year after Tyndale's death, someone made some edits to his translation and republished his translation of the Bible. The Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer, then said to the king that, you know what, Henry, you should authorize this Bible for use in all English churches. Henry was like, all right, and he did. And that was it. And it was renamed the Great Bible. Just a year after Tyndale was executed for translating it into English, the king puts an English Bible in all the churches. And apparently, the sudden access to the Bible for the first time for people caused so much excitement and furore that Henry had to issue new regulations limiting the reading of the Bible to wealthy merchants and aristocrats. Like, people were just so excited. He was like, oh no, we've got to put some new rules in this. Just wealthy people and aristocrats can read it. But this was a huge development. Like, before, the Bible was only available in Latin, so only the clergy could read it. But now everyone had access to the Bible. Before long, a new movement began in England, and they were called the Puritans. Now, the Puritans took seriously what they read in the Bible, and they tried to live their lives by it. They believed you had to have a conversion experience to become a Christian. They believed you weren't just baptized as a baby into it. You know, there was something, a decision you had to make. They believed the Bible was a guidebook to live your life by. And they believed in trying to construct a society based on the Bible. I mean, it sounds a lot like what you and I believe, really, because it is. Now, in 1604, they asked King James for a new translation of the Bible. And the result was the King James Version of the Bible. But life began to get difficult for the Puritans in England. So in the early 1600s, a group of them moved to Holland. And this group, again, like we saw the Anabaptists, they couldn't find babies getting baptized anywhere in the Bible. So they started baptizing believers instead. And in 1609, their pastor baptized himself and his congregation of 40, and they became the first Baptist church over there in Holland. In 1620, another group of 100 Puritans set sail from England in a ship called the Mayflower. You can see where this is going. 2 months later, they arrived in America, the first European settlers in America. And they were able to live according to their beliefs without being persecuted by the authorities. Now, the Catholic Church did fight back against the Reformation across Europe with what's become known as the Counter-Reformation. They addressed a number of the abuses within the Catholic Church, and they also formed the Jesuit movement. Now, the Jesuits were like kind of Catholic super missionaries, you know, they're like the SAS missionaries, of Catholic missionaries. They were really well-trained Catholic missionaries who were intensely loyal to the Pope. And they promised to go wherever the Pope would send them. And they halted the growing tide of Protestantism in France and Central Europe. And they were also very influential at the Catholic Church Council of Trent in 1545, which basically reiterated all the core Catholic doctrines, such as saints, confession, indulgences, and 7 sacraments. The Council of Trent also rejected everything from the Reformation and ensured that there would be no accommodation with Protestants. This ensured that the Catholic Church wouldn't just cave and become Protestant, but that there would be a permanent divided church. Catholic on one side, Protestant on the other. And we're going to have another group discussion very soon, but this Catholic resurgence, it wasn't only being felt in Europe. About 20 years before the Reformation began in 1492, Christopher Columbus, I'm sure we've all heard about him and learned about him in school, Christopher Columbus landed in what we know today as the West Indies. And historians describe the next 150 years as the age of discovery, as Europeans, mainly Catholic, Spanish, and Portuguese, conquered the Americas. And in 1521, the great Aztec Empire in Mexico was defeated. And in 1533, the Incas had been defeated too. The Spanish and Portuguese conquerors, they felt it was their obligation to spread the word of God, so that not only bring armies and guns to these places, but they would also bring priests and missionaries to evangelize these so-called newly conquered people groups too. So it's important to understand that this was all happening during the time of Martin Luther. So on the one hand, while Catholicism was under threat in Europe, it was gaining many new converts in the Americas, but also in India and Japan and China, as Portuguese trading ships reached these places and brought Catholic missionaries with them. Though it has to be said, particularly in the Americas, the methods used to convert people was a little bit questionable, shall we say. More often than not, Spanish soldiers would point their guns at a group of indigenous people and pretty much say, convert to Christianity or we'll shoot you, which is not exactly the methodology that Jesus had in mind, I don't think, when he called us to make disciples of all nations. You know, I don't think that was what he had in mind. But so a lot of the conversions were a little bit coerced and forced in that sense. So the Reformation rediscovered the authority of the Bible, which had been lost for like 1,000 years. So many of the things we take for granted as believers today were rediscovered during the Reformation. And these rediscoveries came at a great cost to many people. The Reformation started quite simply because people started to read the Bible again. And, you know, for me, as I've kind of been like researching this and doing the work for this, I just looked to the side while I was doing this, and I looked at my Bible. I know it's a green Bible, still a Bible. I just looked at my Bible and I thought, you know what? People have gave their lives to give me an English translation of this book. I should probably read it a bit more, shouldn't I? So that was just a little bit of, I don't know, something that came to me while I was preparing this. But that brings us to the end of the Reformation era, from 1517 to 1648. Now, what I want to do now, we've just got one section left. It's a bit of a shorter one. I want us to just, we're going to have a breakout room, a discussion group. Real simply, in your group, what I'd love you to discuss is, which part of the church history we've just covered would you most like to have lived in? And which part would you least like to have lived in? And why? Just go around your group, everyone just share, which part would you most like to have lived in, which part would you least like to have lived in, and why? And we'll give you 10 minutes for that. Does that sound okay, Josephine?
Yeah, okay, great. So I've opened those rooms, so if we can be back at 12:30.
I can tell you where in church history we're going next. We're going to section 4, the modern church, 1648 to the present day. It's the 4th section in your handouts. We're going to just start by looking at this kind of 1648 to 1789, and basically in the mid 1600s, a new movement began. It was called the Enlightenment, and it was a completely new way of looking at God, the world, and oneself, which led to the early start of secularism, really. Now, the Middle Ages and the Reformation had all been ages of faith. Okay, faith in God was central to everything. Okay, you may have differences about that, but it was all about you believe in God. Whereas the Enlightenment rejected that, and reason in the Enlightenment, reason replaced faith as the most important thing. And Enlightenment thinking grew from 3 areas. There was 3 things that led to the Enlightenment. Okay, the first was the Renaissance, which means rebirth, and the Renaissance basically birthed a real confidence in man and his powers and what he could achieve. Okay, and all of a sudden everyone were like, okay, it's all about God. No, it's all about us. I can do stuff. I trust myself. I'm pretty good. And that's what the Renaissance. I mean, there's a lot more to be said on the Renaissance, but it birthed that idea. And then the Enlightenment also was helped by many people just getting sick and tired of so many appalling religious conflicts, you know, wars between Catholic states and Protestant states over something of theology, and loads of people getting killed. People were just like, oh, I'm just tired of this. And the Enlightenment was also helped to come about by the rise of science and discovery. It was around this time that Copernicus discovered that the sun is the center of the solar system, not the Earth. Kepler found that the sun emitted a magnetic force that moves the planets. He found this out at that time. Galileo made his first telescope to see planets. Newton discovered gravity. These discoveries turned people's worldviews on their heads. And what they also did was they created a new belief in human reason. You know, the whole idea that, you know what, we can maybe figure this whole thing out ourselves. You know, maybe we don't need God to help us. Maybe we're smart enough to figure this whole thing out ourselves. And that whole attitude began to grow in this period. You see, for like 1,200 years, people, generally everyone, had just taken for granted that man is a sinner and we need the grace of God. We need God to intervene to help us. And that the good stuff we get through God is dispensed through the church. Everyone just believed that. That was just standard everywhere. And what the state's job was to do was to uphold the truth and punish error and help the church out. Now, there was a complete shift. People started to think, okay, you know what? Maybe I'm not such of a sinner. Maybe I'm not so bad after all. And maybe rather than needing God's grace, maybe I just need like some common sense. Maybe I don't need to read the Bible. Maybe I just need some education and some upbringing and some manners, and like that'll be the key to improving life and society. And a lot of kind of writers who kind of espoused a number of these kind of thoughts was like John Locke, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, numerous people like that. But there was a difference here. Now, the church wasn't immune to attacks and criticism before then, but unlike previous critics of the church, these men made their criticism from outside of the church. You know, like Martin Luther was like, I'm a Christian, I believe in God, and I'm criticizing the church. But these guys were outside of it. No, we're not part of the church. They didn't believe in God. You know, they weren't part of the church. This was a huge shift in worldview. Generally, people had always believed in God, but now this was changing, or certainly society promoted that belief in God. Now, on the European continent around this time, a movement began called Pietism. Now, Pietists believed in personal faith, in Bible study, in evangelism, and moving away from state churches to fellowships of those who had a living faith in God. And one man influenced by the Pietists was a guy called Nicholas Count von Zinzendorf. I've actually said it right. Great. Nicholas Count von Zinzendorf. Now, he allowed a group of Pietists to live on his land, and they formed a kind of monastic community without the celibacy. And they were given the name Moravians, and they had this real focus on prayer. They're always praying. Now, you may have heard of the modern day 24/7 prayer movement led by Pete Greig. Now, this movement really looks to the Moravians for much of their inspiration. And the Moravians, they had this intense missionary desire, sending missionaries all over the world. And Pietism has shaped much of how we live out our Christian faith today, even though we may not know it. Now, someone who was influenced by the Pietists was a Church of England minister called John Wesley, who lived in the 1700s. Now, Wesley started a movement in England, I'm sure we've all heard of it, called Methodism. Now, what was revolutionary about Methodism was it was very much a movement of the people. You know, it was about prayer and people reading their Bibles and sharing their faith themselves and discipling each other. And these little groups with discipleship questions. And, you know, it's very much a movement of the people. The church up to that point had very much been top down. You know, I am the minister, I will tell you what to do. But Methodism was like kind of people grasping hold of things and going out and doing stuff themselves. Methodism was a movement of the people, encouraging people to take responsibility for their own walks with God. Now, John Wesley studied at Oxford, and him and his brother Charles formed a little group at Oxford, a little group of guys who took their faith really seriously. They read their Bible together, they prayed together, and loads of people began to mock them for this. Like, who are these religious nerds taking their faith really seriously? What are they doing here? Look at them all praying and reading their Bible. So their mates and other students started to mock them and ridicule them, and they gave them mocking names. One of the names they called them was the Bible Moths. Another name was, they called them the Reforming Club. And one of the mocking nicknames they gave the Wesley brothers and their mates was the Methodists. And the name stuck. The Methodist name stuck. Now, after being ordained, Wesley, he was ordained in the Church of England, Wesley was asked to become vicar of a church in America. So he went. But as the vicar of this church in America, he was very, very strict on his congregation. Really, really strict. And his strictness was really unpopular among his congregation in this church in America. Okay, his congregation really didn't like him very much. And things got a little bit worse. I mean, he actually ended up having an affair with a woman in America while he was at this church, a woman from his church. But she ditched him. She left him, and she ended up going and marrying another guy who's in the church. Now, John hit back at this woman from his church who had ditched him by barring her from having communion at church on Sundays. I mean, that was how he hit back at her. Her new husband was really annoyed at this. Like, how dare you bar my wife from having communion? You can't do that. So her new husband sued John Wesley, the vicar, for not allowing his wife to have communion. Okay, there was a long trial. It was a mess. It was a complete mess. And John Wesley eventually just said, "I'll sack this," and he returned back to England. He returned back to England, a bit of a broken man, really. It was not a good experience at all. But a few months later, after he arrived back in England in 1738, he had this kind of moment with God, like this spiritual awakening, where he just described it. He says, "I just got an incredible assurance of who I was in Christ." And through this moment, and also through the encouragement of his friend, fellow preacher John Whitefield, Wesley he was just a changed man. There was something different about him. And he just set out and began preaching the gospel wherever he could, indoors, outdoors, wherever people would listen. He would just rock up, preach the gospel. He even showed up at his old Anglican church and asked, could he preach? And they wouldn't let him in the door. So what he did was he went round to the graveyard, and his dad by this stage was dead. He stood on his dad's gravestone and preached to all the people who had shown up. Hundreds of people had shown up to hear him preach. And that's how he preached in open air. Wherever people would listen to him, he would preach to them. Now, it's estimated, and he kept doing this right throughout his lifetime, it's estimated that in his lifetime, John Wesley covered 250,000 miles on horseback, going around different bits of the country preaching to people who would listen. Now, John Wesley, many thousands of people got saved through his ministry. It's worth saying, I didn't mention it at the start, John Wesley wasn't the easiest guy to live with. You know, he was married, but after 2 years, his wife left him. You know, she'd had enough. He wasn't the easiest guy to live with. But that said, by the time he died, he left a fantastic legacy. By the time he died, there were 79,000 Methodists in England and 40,000 Methodists in America. Fantastic legacy. Now, while all this was happening in England, a spiritual awakening was happening in America, which was called the Great Awakening. And this began in the 1720s. Basically, some pastors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania started seeing lots of conversions. Lots of people get saved. And it then spread to Virginia and the Carolinas and eventually to Massachusetts. Now, the Great Awakening turned into a full-on revival in 1739 when English preacher George Whitefield came across from England and did a preaching tour around the New England states. And before long, now we're not sure of the exact numbers, but it's between 25 and 50,000 people got saved during this time in the New England states alone. And this led to a series of further revivals and awakenings in America and Europe over the next 150 years. Now, despite the beginnings of the Enlightenment revivals in England and America, revivals in England and America meant that thousands of people came to Christ in the 1700s. And this missionary focus would increase in the 1800s, as well as a new focus on social justice. Christians started to take up the mantle of social justice. Now, in the late 1700s, a small group of influential Christian leaders began regularly getting together in the small village of Clapham, just outside London, to discuss what was wrong with the world and what they could do about it. And this little group was led by MP William Wilberforce. I know you've all heard of him. And this group tackled lots of issues, and the most famous of which they tackled was slavery. Now, in 1770, of the 100,000 slaves transported from West Africa each year. That's how many slaves were transported each year from West Africa. Of the 100,000 slaves in 1770 that were transported, Britain transported half of them, okay? And the rest of the world transported the other half. So many people in Britain made a lot of money from the slave trade. And in 1789, Wilberforce began to campaign to end slavery. And for over 40 years, he tirelessly campaigned for the end of slavery. And on the 25th of July, 1833, 40 years later, after tirelessly campaigning for most of his life, Parliament finally passed the Emancipation Act, freeing all slaves in the British Empire. Wilberforce died 4 days later after the act was passed. Very fitting. Now, the passing of this act banning slavery in the British Empire is hugely significant because of what was going to happen next. See, European powers were just about to basically conquer Africa and carve it up between themselves. Now, this law made sure that slavery would play no part in any area of Africa that was going to be controlled by Britain. Now, imagine if this law had not been passed and that Britain went into Africa. Imagine, it would have been catastrophic, the amount of slavery and awful things that would have happened. So that's why this is hugely significant, this law. Wilberforce and his friends were motivated by their Christian faith to fight against injustice and stand up for the oppressed and the poor. And poverty in England was a massive problem at this time too. And many Christians such as George Muller and Charles Haddon Spurgeon set up orphanages at this time to rescue destitute street children. And poverty was particularly bad in London. Apparently in London in 1890, it was recorded that 2,157 people had just been found dead, like just dead in the street. It was recorded that there were 2,297 suicides in London that year. There were 30,000 people living in prostitution in London then. There were 160,000 people who'd been convicted of drunkenness then, and more than 900,000 people were classed as paupers or being very poor. So a man called William Booth was drawn to help London's poor, and his street preaching in the 1880s saw many get saved. And within 11 years of him starting preaching, he set up 32 kind of centers where they'd be preaching or they would help the poor. 32 centers or stations, as they came to be known, called, doing evangelism and helping the poor in London. And his workers were really well organized. They kind of organized like an army, and soon they were given the name the Salvation Army, and William Booth was given the name General Booth. And by the late 1800s, William Booth had established 1,000 of these centers or stations, and sent people to many places and many other nations across the world. Now, the 1800s also saw the growth of the Christian missionary movement. And the guy who started this missionary movement was William Carey. Okay, I'm just going to throw that up there. You know, with our 9 key events that we're talking about, if you're wanting to get them in the right order, listen to this bit, okay? Right? The guy who started this missionary movement was William Carey. Now, William Carey, he's commonly known as the father of the modern day mission movement. Now, William Carey was a shoemaker, and apparently, he wasn't a rich guy, wasn't wealthy. Apparently, he learned Greek and Hebrew in his breaks while he was making shoes. And he would put a big map of the world on his shoemaking table so he could study all the countries that he wanted to go to and preach the gospel. Now, in the late 1700s, it's important to understand, the late 1700s, people in churches didn't believe they should take the gospel to foreign lands. They didn't believe that. They just believed, okay, those people are heathens over there, let's just leave them be. They're not Christian countries, let's not do mission. That was not a thing that people believed in then. And apparently at a Baptist ministers' meeting in the late 1700s, Carey got up and argued that they should go to these countries and share the gospel and see people get saved because they were lost otherwise. So he made this argument. And apparently when he was standing up and he was sharing this, an older minister shouted out and said, "Young man, sit down. You're an enthusiast. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do it without consulting you or me." And this older minister, that's what he said to John Carey. He told him to sit down, shut up, be quiet, we're not doing mission. But Carey was undeterred. And in 1592, just after this minister's meeting, he published a book called An Inquiry. It's got a very long title, this book. An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. I'd love to be there with William Carey when he's bringing out his book, just to help him shorten that title, because yeah, it's the longest book title ever. But anyway, in this book, he basically knocked down the 5 objections people had to taking the gospel to the world. The first objection people had was distance, too far away. The second was barbarism. These people are savages. The third was danger. It's really dangerous. The fourth was difficulties of support. And the fifth was language. He just obliterated these barriers. And basically, as soon as he wrote that book, he started his own missionary society. And at his first sermon at his new missionary society, he said this famous line from William Carey: "Expect great things from God, attempt great things from God." And pretty much as soon as he did that, he left for India, the city of Serampore. And he spent 25 years there. He produced 6 complete translations of the Bible in different languages and 25 partial translations into new languages. And many others, inspired by his example, followed in his footsteps and became missionaries in foreign countries. William Carey began the modern day missionary movement. That's why he's so significant. Before him, churches in England were not involved in foreign missions at all. They were like, we don't do that. We don't send people to these countries to tell them about Jesus. We don't do that. After him, supporting foreign missions had become part of normal church life. William Carey changed the whole outlook towards foreign mission. He put the gospel back to the center and unified Christendom around reaching the lost. That's why he's so significant. But the 1700s and the 1800s saw a move away from the clergy, the ministers doing everything, to average people stepping up and preaching the gospel, looking after the poor and fighting for justice. Now we're going to look at just this final section, 1914 to the present day. Now, I'm sure most of us know what happened in 1914. It was the start of the First World War. The first half of but let's just pull back a little bit from the First World War, a little bit earlier than that. The first half of the 20th century saw severe persecution of Christians by nationalism and communism. For the first time in 500 years, it didn't matter if you were Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. You got persecuted just the same way as everyone else. You know, like Hitler's Nazi regime, the Soviet Union, Stalin, they didn't care whether you were Orthodox, Protestant, or Catholic. You'd get persecuted just the same. Persecution was particularly brutal in Stalin's Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. And it's interesting, in the 1900s, the liberal idea of the good of man and progress had been growing in strength. People began to believe that the more educated and cultured people became, the more society would progress to the point where wars would no longer happen and religion would no longer be needed. It was just kind of thought, look, if we just provide people with enough education and teaching and learning, they'll be cultured, they'll improve, they'll better themselves, wars will no longer happen, we won't need religion, things will all be hunky-dory. Now, this idea grew in strength until the First and Second World Wars happened. The bloodiest conflicts our world has ever known. And the bloodiest conflicts our world had ever known happened not among primitive peoples in the distant past, but in the developed world of the 20th century. 85 million people died in World War II alone, which is 3% of the world's population back then. So this whole idea of the progress of man was dead. You know, the aftermath of the Second World War left people just with so many questions, like, what, you know, if the progress of man is dead, like, what hope is there? If man was supposed to be progressing and then we had these 2 awful wars, like, what's happened? People were looking for hope. And 2 figures played really important roles in providing this hope after the Second World War. The first is English writer C.S. Lewis, and the second is American evangelist Billy Graham. Now, C.S. Lewis, in a series of lectures on the BBC just after the Second World War, renewed people's hope after the disillusionment of World War II by pointing them to Jesus, pretty much. And these lectures were soon turned into a book called Mere Christianity, one of my favorite Christian books, still an incredibly influential book to this day. Now, around this time, American evangelist Billy Graham, again, if we're talking about our 9 key events, be listening here. Billy Graham began large-scale preaching tours, eventually filling stadiums of people right across the world who came to hear him preach. And he called these tours crusades. I don't quite know why he called them crusades. I wouldn't have called them crusades, knowing what actually happened in the crusades, but that's what he went for in terms of the name. He called them the crusades. But over the next 60 years, he held over 400 of these crusades, these big preaching events. And he preached over the next 60 years, he preached to 215 million people in person, preached the gospel to 215 million people in person in 185 countries across the world. That's almost every country in the world, as well as to over 1 billion people through TV and radio. Billy Graham preached the gospel to more people than anyone else in history. And through his ministry, millions of people across the world were saved, which renewed and strengthened the church across the world. That's Billy Graham. Now, the post-war era also saw reforms in the Catholic Church. In 1598, the Pope called a church council called Vatican II, with the aim of bringing the Catholic Church up to date. And many changes came as a result of Vatican II. The altar in Catholic churches was brought forward, closer to the people. Priests now faced the congregation when delivering Mass, and services could now be conducted in people's own language instead of in Latin, which had been the case up to that point. Now, in the 60s and 70s, the rise of secularism, which is like the rejection of religion, it hit traditional Protestant denominations pretty hard. You know, it's like Presbyterian, not particularly American, a lot of the Methodist churches, Anglican churches, hit them pretty hard. Church attendance in many of these denominations plummeted during this time, but by contrast, evangelical churches, churches centered on the gospel of salvation by grace through Jesus, as well as charismatic and Pentecostal churches, they flourished during this time. And when these churches were asked why they thought they were growing, there was a survey done, and they generally responded with three answers why they thought they were growing while many other churches were not. The first reason these churches gave as to why they were growing was they said that it's because we're being faithful to the Bible. The second reason these churches said is why we're growing is because we're giving solid answers to life's big questions. We're giving solid answers to life's big questions. And the third reason they gave as to why they were growing was that we're efficiently organized. Being faithful to the Bible, giving solid answers to life's big questions, and being efficiently organized. These were these are the three reasons. These are why we think we're growing. Now, obviously, God's involved in that, but these are the three reasons they gave. Now, during this time, mega churches started to emerge in America, which were large churches with great facilities and programs, often seeking to be more relevant to those not familiar with traditional church. And the 1960s also saw a charismatic renewal, where lots of people rediscovered many of the gifts of the Spirit, such as healing, prophecy, and speaking in tongues. And the denomination that I'm part of, which is New Frontiers, came out of this movement. But it wasn't the first great move of the Spirit in the 20th century. The Azusa Street revivals in Los Angeles in 1909 saw the beginning of the modern day Pentecostal movement. The Vineyard movement, led by John Wimber in the 1980s, also had a big impact, particularly in the area of healing, on the Western church. Now, Pentecostals and charismatics now make up a quarter of the Christians in the world, it is believed. Now, we've spent most of our time up to this point looking at Christianity in Europe, but we've got to face the fact that Europe is no longer the center of Christianity anymore. And it's not America either. The 20th century has seen a global shift of Christianity to the south and to the east. You know, more Christians now worship in Anglican churches in Nigeria each week than in all the Anglican churches of Britain, Europe, and North America combined. Okay, I'm going to say that again. More Christians now worship in Anglican churches in Nigeria each week than all the Anglican churches of Britain, Europe, and North America combined. Okay, there are more Baptists in the Congo now than there are in Great Britain. You know, so things have shifted south and east. In Africa, in 1900, there were 10 million Christians, which was 9% of the population of the continent. In the year 2000, there were 380 million Christians, which is 46% of the population of the continent. Huge growth in the last 100 years. In South Korea, in 1914, one in 100 people were Christians. Now, it's 1 in 3. South Korea is also now home to the world's biggest churches. Yoido Full Gospel Church in South Korea is the world's biggest church with 1 million members. South Korea is also second only to the USA for the number of theological colleges it has and the number of missionaries it sends out. And in China, the rate of Christian growth is just astonishing. There are now more people in church on Sunday in China than there are in all of Western Europe combined. And if the Christian growth rate in China continues at its current levels, in 10 years, it will have more Christians than any other country in the world. And there's this interesting thing that has started in China called the Back to Jerusalem movement. It was given a lot of publicity by Brother Yun back in 2003. Brother Yun has written that famous book, The Heavenly Man. And basically what the Back to Jerusalem movement is if you think about it, like Christianity kind of started out in Jerusalem, and generally it's kept going west around the world. You know, it went up to Antioch, went over to Rome, France, England, went over to America, and it's kind of come from America to China. And basically the Back to Jerusalem movement is saying, okay, Christianity's kind of went around the globe and it's got to China. And what we want to do is we want to complete the circle and send Christianity from China back to Jerusalem. So they have this plan in China of sending 100,000 missionaries to 51 countries along the road from China back to Jerusalem, along the ancient Silk Road trading route. Now, the interesting thing is these are most of the countries where it's most dangerous to be a Christian and evangelize. But this is a real audacious attempt. They're like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to send missionaries to all these countries from China to see loads of people get saved and just bring the gospel the whole way around back to Jerusalem. Really interesting. Anyway, I'm almost done, I promise. But Christianity, I just want to talk finally about Christianity in the Muslim world. Christianity is growing very fast in the Muslim world. It's not something we hear about on the news. There's a great book by a guy called David Garrison. He's written a book called Wind in the House of Islam. And he defines something, he talks about movements. And David Garrison says a movement is when either 1,000 people get saved and baptized in a region, or 100 new churches are planted in a region. He says when one of those things happen, or both, we say that a movement for Christianity, a movement for the gospel has taken place. All right? Now, he says, he's done his research, and he says, in terms of research, he says, between the year 622 and the year 1800, okay, so that's a period of 1,200 years, he says there were 0 movements to Christianity in the Muslim world, the Middle East. Then he says between 1800 and 1980, that's a period of 180 years, he said there were 2 movements to Christianity in the Muslim world. Okay, 2 movements were either 1,000 people got saved and baptized in the Muslim world, or 100 churches were planted in a region. Then he says between 1980 and 2000, there were 11 movements. Now, this is just 20 years. Okay, imagine there was none in 1,200 years. There was 2 in 180 years. He says between 1980 and 2000, there were 11 movements to Christianity in the Muslim world. Okay, so that's a massive increase. And then he says between the year 2000 and 2013, when he published his book, there were 69 movements to Christianity within the Muslim world, the Middle East. Okay, so that's a massive turning to Christ in the Muslim world. Huge change. So why are so many Muslims coming to Christ in the Middle East, in the Muslim world? Well, first reason is the Bible is now available in the language of most Muslim people groups. That's a huge thing. Many Muslims are now experiencing dreams and visions pointing them to Jesus. I've got a guy in our church. He showed up because Jesus appeared to him in a dream. And he's like, I want to know who this guy is who tells me to read the Bible. Who is this? You know? Yeah, so that's happening. Also, access to Christian media has also had a big impact. You know, people can access Christian channels on TV and radio and all that kind of stuff, no matter where you are in the world now. And more recently, a lot of the cultural baggage that has traditionally accompanied the gospel has been removed. You know, people who are evangelizing are realizing we don't want to make people Americans. No, we want to make them disciples. So they're removing all the cultural baggage and just aiming to make disciples of Jesus. And also, what's helping a lot of Muslims turn to Christ is just the widespread disillusionment in the Middle East with Muslim extremism and violence. This has also played a huge factor. And Christianity is spreading faster than ever in this area. It's not the thing that the BBC is going to report on or you're going to see on the news, but it's happening, and it's happening on the down low. It definitely is. So there you have it. That's the history of the church, warts and all. I know there are multitudes of things I have not covered or not covered adequately, but that is, I hope, an overview of the church. And I just want to say, just to be finished, you know, for me, doing all the preparation for this, it's just, I don't know, like, it's just reminded me of how important it is to keep the gospel, the good news of Jesus dying on the cross for our sins, keeping that front and center in my life and in the church I lead. Because I think what I've learned, I've been reminded of through all this, is that when we lose sight of the gospel as a church, as the church regularly did in church history, things get really messy. But when we keep it at the center, people get saved, lives get transformed, and things flourish. And what I find so encouraging about what we've studied today is that there's no perfect people in this story. You know, God uses weak and imperfect people to bring about his plan. And that is encouraging for us all. All of us are part of this story. We all have a part to play. And I was just reading the news the other day, you know, and it's easy to read the news, you know, and every story seems to be like bad stuff, you know. It's like, oh, this bad thing's happening here, this bad thing's happening here. This can be easy to get depressed reading the news. And you know, it can seem like the world is just in an awful state. But, you know, studying church history over this last while as I've kind of preparing this has just reminded me that no matter how bad things look, God is still in control. He still has a plan, and he's working it out, even when we can't see it. So I'm finished. I mean, hold on. Actually, no, before I finish, right, we're going to go through our order, the correct order of our 9 things, right? Are you ready? Who's ready to see the correct order? Are you ready? Okay, most of you have probably already Googled it, so you know it anyway, but we're gonna do this. Now, I think a few of you had it correct earlier, but I kind of didn't want to say it, but let me see. Where are we? Yes, let's go here. So the correct order is, are you ready? Are we ready? Yes, drum roll. You've all got your cameras muted, or your mics. Let's go. The first event was the Apostle Paul beginning his missionary journeys, which was in the 40s. Next event, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD. Next event, the canon is closed, which is an interesting one. I think it was probably closed in about 190. But you could say that some of the first lists we have weren't until a bit later than that. But the next one has the canons closed, 190. Then we've Constantine becomes the Roman Emperor, 312. The church splits into Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, 1054. The Crusades take place. I think they started in 1095. Then Martin Luther starts the Reformation, 1517. William Carey goes to India, which is 1792. And finally, we have Billy Graham begins his crusades, which I think was in 1946. Well done for those of you who got it right. Yeah, great job. I think, what am I going to do now? Right, final thing, really, really quick. I've got 10 seconds left. Just have a look at the further reading page on your notes. I think Rodney Start's Rise of Christianity is on there. Great read. I think if you just want to like read something that just covers everything in church history, I think the best one I would recommend is Nick Needham's 2000 Years of Christ's Power. It's a series. It's 5 books. It's brilliant. Really easy to read. So if you want to do further reading, that's a fantastic one. Now, if you're like, I don't want to read 5 books about church history, I just want to read one, okay? If you just want a 1-volume book on church history, Bruce Shelley's Church History in Plain Language is great. It says what it is, okay? It's church history in plain language, which is easy to understand, yeah? That's really helpful book. Yeah, and the others are good too, but that's just a few recommendations. Richard, I'm done. I'm over to you. Richard, Josephine, whoever's taken over.
Thanks, Andy. Just unmuting myself. Just on behalf of all of us, thanks so much. That was an impossible task done really well. So it was really good highlights and thrilling to finish on the kind of our mission challenge nowadays to keep the gospel front and center in our own personal lives and the church, and also just to hear some of the behind the scenes news of what's actually going on in the so-called Muslim world, which is all part of God's world, of course. So thanks so much. We're really grateful that you spent the morning with us, and thank your wife and the boys as well for sparing you. We're really grateful. Just to say to everyone else, do sign up for next year if you would like to. It's obviously a little bit difficult getting literature around, so I've dropped off some envelopes with leaflets into churches. Some inexplicably don't have post boxes, but that's another subject. But of course we're not meeting, so you won't get the leaflet, but Josephine's emailed details around. If you've lost it or don't think you've had it, check in the file for all the stuff that goes into the bin. And if you still haven't got it, do contact us and ask for details and sign up, because it looks good. But we'll see you again in December for my friend John Hosier, who is one of the few people that can make Revelation look really interesting. So and not too crazy as well. So we'll look forward to that. So I don't know if, Josephine, have you got anything that you need to add from an admin point of view?
No, not really. I guess the request is please book yourselves in. I've had a few emails saying, please, could you book me in? But it'd be great actually if you could book yourselves in, because there's a link in the emails that I've sent you, but I'll make sure that when I send out the link for today's session, I will put a link in again so that you can actually book yourselves in rather than get me to do it. Just to save me a bit of time. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Well, I'll pray then, and then you can get on with the rest of your lockdown day and have a great weekend. So, Father, thank you that you sent your Son for us. Thank you, Holy Spirit, that you're working in our churches, that we're the very temple of your Spirit. You work through us. Thank you, Jesus, that you promised you would build your church, and you're doing so in good times, in bad times, in persecution, in times of pestilence and virus as well. And so we entrust ourselves and each other to you, and we ask you continue to use us as we stay close to you and faithful to your gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, God bless you, Andy. Thanks again for being with us. Thanks, Isaac and Josephine, for making it all possible as well. So have a good weekend, folks.